Hello and welcome, guys. Make yourselves comfortable and enjoy. This is Affinity, Chaos. Chapter 831. Gray and Void decided to check out the volcano. There was nothing left for them to do anyway. Knowing that they were on the same continent made them calm down relatively quickly. With Gray's tracking device, they knew the general direction they had to go. As they ascended the volcano, the temperature started to drop at an alarming rate. The amusing thing was that there was no ice on the volcano as they climbed it, yet they could feel the air getting cold, even their breaths were visible. "What is this place?" Basil asked. Of the trio, he was the water elementalist, so he was fascinated by the prospect of seeing something that might help him advance in his cultivation. "A volcano, obviously," Bert replied, rubbing his hands together because of the cold. "I know, but have you seen a volcano like this before?" Basil said. "This should be a special type of fire." Braden pondered. Of the trio, he was the one recognized to be the smartest. He was also the space elementalist. Not just that, but according to what Gray found out from them, he was also the eldest of the triplet. "Correct, it's clearly a flame, but it gives off icy chills. It's even colder than most of the ice users I've encountered, excluding that ice dragon." Gray joined in on the conversation. After getting them to be his lackeys, he built a good relationship with them. Although the way they started was a little on the wrong foot, is building a relationship where they could trust each other. They wouldn't be equals, but they wouldn't be his slaves as well. They were here to help him out on some things, and they had the right to give out their suggestions. Even the triplet was a little surprised at how Gray was treating them. They were 100% certain that if they were in Gray's position, then they would naturally maltreat him. He wasn't from their race, so they did not need to sympathize with him. They continued speaking as they ascended the volcano. The triplets soon brought out their horns, and it gave off a glow that covered their bodies, keeping the cold away from them. While this was going on, Gray's eyes were shining with a pale blue light, identical to that of the corpse he encountered while escaping. "Mars." "Gray." Braden called out to Gray when he noticed the color of his eyes. He had never seen Gray's eyes emit pale blue glows before, so he was a little curious. "Who?" Gray looked at him, a little puzzled. "Your eyes, they're blue," Braden pointed out. "Wait, what?" Gray was taken aback. He quickly used his water element to create a piece of thin ice that made something like a mirror for him. Looking at it, he was stunned. It was as if he was staring into the eyes of the corpse. It hadn't been long since he saw the corpse, so he still recalled how its eyes looked. "What's happening?" he muttered, flabbergasted by what was happening. Due to the panic of the spatial tunnel breaking apart, he panicked, so he didn't notice when the light entered his body. Even if he did, the panic of the spatial tunnel wouldn't make him think much about it. "Aren't these the same eyes that the corpse had?" Void asked after staring at the eyes for some time. Gray nodded, trying to compose himself. While he was thinking of how it happened, he recalled what happened after he entered the spatial tunnel. He saw a flash of blue light, but he didn't see where it went. Originally, he thought it was from the space around, but now he understood it wasn't. He didn't know what to do because he was unsure of his next course of action. There was no way he could pick out the cause of the light, nor could he expel it from his body. He didn't know if it would be harmful to him or not. This is getting a bit too complicated. He thought to himself, could the corpse have been what helped out with the teleportation array, also sending me here to acquire something, or is it just a coincidence? Multiple questions ran through his head. It was a little odd that as soon as the blue light flashed by, the tunnel stabilized and they were sent here. It would have been okay if they were just sent here, but for some reason, he felt some resonance with a volcano he had never seen before, and also from how it seemed to activate on his own as he ascended the mountain, there must have been a connection between the two. The more he thought about it, the more he felt this was the most likely explanation. It made sense if for some reason the corpse sensed his blue flames and the remnant consciousness in the body helped send him to acquire its legacy or something like that. But with my luck, will something like that really be possible? He asked himself another question. Unknown to him, his hypothesis was a little off. The blue light affected the destination, but without his protector helping to stabilize the tunnel, it would have been impossible for him to land here. His luck also played a role in this, because, in the case that his protector managed to send him to his original destination, he would have missed the chance of appearing here. When Gray appeared here, his protector also appeared as well. He hid in the void as he watched Gray think of how to leave the place. He was still contemplating why Gray appeared in such a desolate place when Gray's eyes started to glow as they ascended the mountain. Don't tell me it's because of that. He was a little unsure. He noticed the light, but he wasn't able to stop it. However, he knew it was harmless since he checked Gray's body and saw it resting in his nebula quietly. He would have been able to force it out, but he could feel that it was meant to help Gray, so he let it be. How lucky looks like he's not always unlucky. He chuckled at the thought of Gray's bad luck all this while. Chapter 832. Gray tried to search for the blue light multiple times, but he was unable to. He didn't know it was resting in his head, and even the thought of that never crossed his mind. With no way to examine it, and given the connection it seemed to have with this volcano, he decided to find out about it after entering the volcano. From what he could tell, only a few people could go in. He was exempted from any form of cold it was emitting, the others were not so lucky, minus Void. Other than the poison miasma, Void seemed to be invincible to other things. I wonder what type of magical beast he is. He mused as they got to the peak of the volcano. At this time, the Horned Men paused at a particular spot past the middle when ascending the volcano. They were unable to go any further, so only Gray and Void continued the ascent. Standing at the peak, they felt a chilly breeze gush out of the volcano. That's not encouraging, Gray said as he tried to move closer. Even with the pale blue light, he still felt this chilly wind. He was 100% certain that if anyone else tried to come in here, they would turn into an ice statue. Void's expression also turned serious as they exchanged glances. Nodding to each other, they walked to the entrance of the volcano. Looking inside, Gray saw something that caught his eye. "Isn't that the same flame?" he almost exclaimed. He had seen something like this before. It was when he added the fire element to his elements. There was a floating blue lotus sitting at the top of the lava, giving off intense chills. Even from so far off, he could feel it. His heart started to beat faster from excitement. He felt an unbelievable sense of joy just staring at this lotus. "Hey, it's like that plant when I was just born," Void commented when he saw the lotus. "It is, but unlike that one, this is a complete one. It seemed to have formed not too long ago," Gray said excitedly. "Nice, looks like we were lucky this time." Void laughed. He could see the joy in Gray's eyes. "Guess so. But do you think I can obtain it so easily?" Gray asked with a wry smile. Void wanted to ask about something when Gray pointed at a moving figure in the volcano. Yes, there was a living creature inside the volcano, resting at the side. It was breathing slowly. "Rank 6, you have work to do." Void grinned at him. The beast resting on the side was a giant double-headed snake in rank 6. Gray wasn't too shocked by it having two heads. What made him almost lose hope was its stage. If it were to be in rank 5, then he could deal with it in the fusion state, but now, he couldn't even dare to fight against it. "I have a plan," Void said, to take Gray out of the depth of depression. Gray nodded for Void to tell him his plan, and after he was done listening to it, his eyes brightened, before going dark once again. "It won't work. It would sense it," Gray said after hearing Void's plan. "Trust me, this thing can perfectly hide the aura of the treasure. Without having a powerful sensory ability, it will never sense it. Why do you think it hasn't moved since we came here? It can only sense us when we get close to it," Void explained. Gray looked at the sleeping snake once again. Void's plan would be able to help him get what he wanted, but it was also very. They would enter the volcano, find a safe spot inside and use the treasure. This would help boost Void's rank to the next one, while also giving them a good chance of acquiring the lotus after he does. The volcano could hide the aura of the treasure, so it would not leak out, attracting other magical beasts. Gray had his doubts about the plan since it involved them putting their hopes on a probability. If it didn't work and the snake sensed them, it would be alert, and could even consume the lotus if they escaped. He stood on the same spot for a while, brooding over the matter seriously. This was not something he could take lightly. Any mistake and his life would be in danger. He started to regret why he didn't use his points to get a teleportation talisman from the faction. There are talismans that are on sale in the faction. It has those made by Sage Plane Elementalists and Elemental Venerables. Had he been able to acquire one made by an Elemental Venerable, he would have been able to take out the Necromancer at first. Teacher's talismans are almost up. I have only 2 left for escaping, and 5 for attacking. He thought out everything that could possibly happen, and after making sure that with his teacher's talisman they could escape, he finally agreed to it. The reason he agreed was simple: if Void manages to break through to the Sage Plane, they could go back to the faction within the week. This way, he would submit his mission and take his points. He wouldn't need a cultivation room any longer since Void had already broken through. In addition, he would get his personal Sage Plane guard with him. It was a win-win every way he looked at it. The duo entered the volcano as quietly as they could, and Void used his sharp claws to break a part of the volcano, creating a cave inside. Gray ensured that none of the rock pebbles fell to the ground when Void was making the cave. The second the duo entered the cave, they closed it once again, and their auras completely disappeared from the place. Of course, Gray waited outside first and handed the treasure to Void, and after he didn't sense Void or the treasure, he was finally reassured. After so long, Void was finally going to break through to the Sage Plane. Chapter 833. 2 days went by in a flash. Gray and Void were still hiding inside the cave they made in the volcano. The treasure was already exhausted, and Gray was currently giving off the aura of a 9th stage Overlord Plane Elementalist. His eyes were still shut as he tried to get used to his new cultivation stage, as well as to figure out what the blue light was. After some time, he managed to locate the blue light. He had tried communicating with it, but he was unable to make it budge in the slightest. While Gray was busy trying to figure out what the pale blue light was and what it was used for, he noticed a change in the surrounding. The essence around the place was converging at a particular spot. Void was on the verge of breaking through to the Sage Plane. Gray opened his eyes and saw Void floating in the air. His eyes shone with a black light that seemed somewhat demonic. His fur fluttered from the wind circulating around due to the excess essence in the area. Even the essence in the volcano rushed there, alerting the double-headed snake. It raised its heads to look in the direction of the commotion. Void lifted into the air and he started to grow larger. This wasn't Gray's first time seeing him in this size, although he was still a little amazed every time he saw it. This will alert the beast. Unfortunately, there's nothing I can do. Hopefully, he breaks through in a short time. Gray muttered as he looked at Void. The converging of the essence started to make the lava in the volcano unsettled as it started to move from side to side. Outside the volcano, the sky was getting darker as the essence circulated in the air. After getting to a particular point, it shot out a single drop of essence that was in a liquid form. Whenever a magical beast or an elementalist gets to the Sage Plane, they would all get this. This is like a blessing from the world, giving them the purest essence it could offer, as well as offering the profoundness of each element. If one was lucky, they could awaken their domains from this. Void already had his space domain. If he could get a second domain, it would boost his strength to another level. Gray hoped this was what happened. The drop of essence dropped into the cave. When the snake saw it, its eyes lit up and it charged straight to the cave. Gray was astounded by the essence. Just staring at it alone gave him a sense of oneness with the world. If he got the chance to observe this thing more, then he would be able to advance his elemental grades faster. If only. He thought as he stared at it. He had heard of people stealing this essence just as the person or beast breaking through assimilates with it. I wonder if those guys will get some things from it. He thought about the triplet. After some time, he found a way to send them inside the cave. Surprisingly, the temperature was okay in the cave. After telling them to try to gain whatever they can before Void completely assimilated with the essence, he stepped into the Void and vanished. He could already sense the aura of the snake as it was rushing in their direction. He appeared outside, blocking the path of the snake. He was already in his fusion state. 3 fusion orbs were in his hands, and it brought out 2 of the attacking talismans he got from his teacher. No matter what, he would make sure Void broke through successfully. The double-headed snake saw Grey, and it naturally paused. When it sensed his aura, it attacked without a second thought. Grey was still in the Overlord plane, and he was no match for it. Grey already knew this would happen, so he didn't panic. With a wave of his hand, the orb shot at the snake. The snake opened its mouth and spat out 2 streams of fire. One headed in Grey's direction while the other collided with the fusion orbs. The orbs broke apart and the impact forced Grey back. He managed to block the second attack, but he still slammed into the wall of the volcano. So this is the difference in strength, eh? He struggled to crawl out of the hole he made on the wall. He knew from the start that he was no match for the snake, but he didn't think the difference in strength was this huge. The Sage plane and the Overlord plane are miles apart. Luckily, all I need to do is delay it. Grey shot out from the hole and used one of his teacher's talismans. The moment the talisman's attack collided with the snake, it smacked Grey with its tail, sending him crashing into the wall once again. The snake was unable to dodge the attack since it didn't think anything of it. It was after it was hit by the attack it knew it was not something it could neglect. However, with Grey gone, it rushed in the direction of its target. Whatever was breaking through to the Sage plane would be gone soon, so it had to ensure it got there before it happened. Boom! The snake retreated when it noticed Grey's presence in front of it. And even before Grey was able to come out of the spatial tunnel, it spat a large fireball at it, pushing Grey back into the spatial tunnel. Grey's figure appeared behind it and it swung its tail at him once again. Grey was getting trounced, but he couldn't let the snake have its way. He was on the verge of crying. The snake was literally forcing him back into the spatial tunnel, making him unable to attack it. If he appeared too far from the snake, then it would be able to dodge the attack easily. The snake wanted to get to Void, but it was apprehensive of the talisman Grey had with him, so it couldn't neglect him. It planned to squash the human pestering it before getting what was left of the essence. It turned around, facing Grey. Chapter 834. Grey was startled when the 2-headed snake turned to his direction. Without being told, he knew the snake wanted to get serious with him now. He hastily retreated, but the snake chased after him and sent out a powerful stream of flames that almost knocked Grey to the ground. Grey was in the fusion state, but he had no choice than to use his teacher's talisman to help boost his speed so he could escape from the snake's attacks. When Grey got a good distance away, in hopes of drawing the snake away, he was left disappointed when the snake quickly turned around and headed in Void's direction. It was already a rank 6 magical beast, so it was very smart. It quickly picked up what Grey wanted to do, so it played along, and when Grey moved further away, it rushed in Void's direction. This thing is too smart for my liking. Grey complained before rushing back to where Void was located. With his space element and his teacher's talisman, he was a little bit faster than the snake. Appearing in front of the snake, he attacked with his fusion orbs, but it didn't have any impact on the snake. The scales of the snake were stronger than Grey's attacks. The snake attacked Grey, but missed. Grey on the other hand continued attacking the snake, making sure it didn't get to Void. Once the snake decides to leave him since he was only using his fusion orbs, he would bring out his teacher's talisman to attack. The strength of a Sage plane elementalist would burst out from it, threatening the snake. The snake would instantly turn its attention to Grey once again. Grey knew he was no match for the snake, so all he did was to repeat this process until Void broke through. He had to use his talisman sparingly since it wasn't much. 10 minutes later, Grey's figure was sent flying and he slammed into the wall of the volcano. There were presently too many holes like this around, and they were all made when Grey slammed into the wall. It couldn't be helped, the snake was just too powerful for him. If not for his light element, he would have sustained too many injuries to even count. Even with the light element, he still had some injuries that hadn't healed up yet. What's holding Void up? Shouldn't he be done by now? Gray was on his last foot. He just used up his last attack talisman, and he was getting beat up by the snake. For some reason the snake attacked more aggressively. Gray guessed it had something to do with not sensing the essence any longer. This meant that Void had already assimilated with it. Even if the snake killed him now, it still wouldn't be able to get it. Gray was sent in different directions as the snake attacked, and as he tried to escape, he was sent crashing down. "Oh shit!" he exclaimed in his head as he saw the direction he was headed. He hastily opened a teleportation tunnel that made him appear on the side. He slammed into the ground, where the snake was previously resting on. If not for this tunnel, he would have crashed into the lava, and although he had the fire element, he would still be in danger from freezing. This fire didn't burn, rather, it froze anything close to it. Standing so close to it, Gray started to shiver from the intense cold. His eyes glowed even brighter, and the lotus, which had been dormant all this while, suddenly started spinning. "What the hell?" Gray blurted out uncontrollably. The snake rushed down when it saw this. From how it tried to get to Gray frantically, Gray was certain it was panicking. "Void?" Gray called out as he tried escaping from the snake which was coming down. The snake appeared on the ground within some seconds. Before Gray could even open up a space tunnel, it swung its massive tail at him, sending him flying away from the lotus. Gray crashed into the ground, almost getting into the lava. Luckily, he stopped only a few feet away from it. The snake didn't stop its attack, it rushed after him, attacking brutally. Gray managed to finally get some distance between himself and the snake. However, the glow in his eyes intensified and the lotus started spinning faster. He knew he had to leave here quickly, or else the snake would try to kill him. The glow from his eyes resonated with the glow the lotus started giving off, alarming the snake. "If that crazy cat doesn't come down soon, I'll kill him," Gray complained as he ran from the snake. He could feel a sort of closeness with the lotus, but he didn't even dare to look in that direction now. The thought of acquiring the lotus did not even cross his mind at the moment. Surviving was his only goal. Initially, he thought Void would be done with his breakthrough soon, but things aren't going as expected. The snake soon caught up with him and sent him flying once again. All the talismans he got from his teacher were used up, so he had to deal with running on his own. There was no way an Overlord Plane Elementalist would be able to outrun a Sage Plane Elementalist. Gray's body was about to slam into the wall by the side when he felt a soft paw on his back. "Great! You're here, deal with it." Gray didn't need to turn before knowing it was Void. He hastily ran in another direction, rushing back to the cave they made at the top of the volcano. He was bleeding all round, and he was certain the internal injuries he sustained were more than what his current mastery of the light element could deal with. His only hope of a quick recovery now was the healing tonic they got from the blooming viper, and even that was almost used up as well. Void stood around 3 meters tall, with an odd look on his face. He wanted to show off his new appearance to Gray, but Gray didn't even give him a glance. He currently had a golden fur around his neck, making him look majestic. The fur was around the same length as his normal fur. Did the beating affect his head? Void muttered before staring at the two-headed snake. The snake was still an early-stage rank 6 magical beast, just like Void. Void looked at the snake with a demeaning look. It was as if he was looking at an inferior beast. "Leave now and you'll live," he said offhandedly. The snake looked at him and snarkled. It looked at Void like it was staring at a moron. It knew Void's bloodline was superior to it, but it also knew that Void broke through only a few minutes ago. He wouldn't even be accustomed to his new strength yet, much less being able to fight against it. "You made a wrong choice. I wonder what you would taste like," Void said carkily as he charged at the snake. Inside the cave, Gray quickly took out the healing tonic and gulped it down. He was going through a lot of pains, and his body was bruised all over. When he stepped into the cave, the 3 horned men were seated in a meditating position. Clearly they had benefited from watching Void's breakthrough. This was the first time they were watching anyone break through to the Sage Plane, so it was bound to be beneficial for them. Gray didn't bother with them since he had to worry about his health. He had red marks all over his body from the times the snake's tail hit him, and his clothes were completely ruined. At this point, he was even sure more than 50% of his ribs were broken. After he gulped down the tonic, he focused on healing himself. However, his eyes continued giving off the pale blue glow. Back in the volcano, the snake was running for its life. In the space of only a few seconds, Void already showed that they were not on equal footing. The snake was currently stuck in what seemed to be a sea of darkness. This was Void's second domain, the domain of darkness. He used a special darkness treasure to break through, so while he was still getting used to the darkness essence from the treasure, he got an insight while he was assimilating with the essence. If people heard of a newly ascended rank 6 magical beast already having 2 domains, they would probably go crazy. However, it can't be helped, Void had the fabled black elemental grade for all his elements, so this was totally natural for him. The snake spat out streams of fire, trying to break away from Void's clutches. "I told you to leave the first time, you mocked me. Now, I want to cook you and eat you, be a good snake and let me kill you, okay?" Void said with an evil laugh. The snake panicked when it heard this and hastily increased the intensity of its flames. It didn't even mind about its health any longer and started to burn its life essence to increase its strength. "It's futile. Against me, all your efforts are worthless. I'll show you what it means to be a great magical beast," Void commented and waved his paws. After waving his paws, he went back to his previous small state. The snake fell to the ground, dead. If it was told from the start that Void would be able to kill it, it would never have believed it. Chapter 835. Void looked at the beast sprawling on the ground, unable to move. The snake was pleading for its life, but Void didn't seem to even care. He was about to kill it when Gray came out from the cave. "Leave it, we can use it later," Gray said as he descended down. He was better than when he ran back. It had been only a few minutes since he used the healing tonic, but he was already almost back to full health. "You're lucky he didn't kill you." Void snorted and smacked one of the heads of the snake. Gray landed by the side, placing his entire focus on the lotus. This was what had most of his interest. Since the snake was already defeated, he didn't need to worry about it any longer. His eyes glowed as he walked close to the lotus. The lava under the lotus churned and gave off intense chills. Void shivered before shaking his head. "I can't stay here while you're doing this. I'm outside." He was about to leave when he noticed the snake's eyes glued to Gray and the lotus. He smacked the snake's head before saying, "If you keep looking, I'll make sure you can't see anything anymore. Now, move." He dragged the snake with him as they stepped out of the volcano. They didn't go to the cave since they would disturb the trio who were training there. Gray didn't bother with Void as his entire focus was on the lotus. He stretched out his hand and the lotus floated in his direction before rotating above his palms. It gave off a cold yet comforting feeling. He touched the bottom part of it and the top opened, revealing a small pale blue flame, dancing in the middle. Compared to the one he absorbed, this one was larger. A strange thing occurred just as he was about to begin the process of absorption. The flame flew on its own and drilled itself into Gray's head, without his approval. Before Gray could move, it was already inside his body. Due to the distance, he couldn't even dodge it. He was forced to sit down cross-legged and start cultivating. This wasn't something he could completely absorb in a single sitting, and he originally planned to start using it after he was fully healed. However, things changed. He sat down close to the lava, with the lotus increasing in size. Before Gray knew it, he was unknowingly sitting under the lotus and it floated above the lava. The essence when cultivating in the lotus was almost double the normal essence. Gray noticed this change, but he couldn't open his eyes to check the cause of it as he focused on getting the best of this experience. Time flew by and 2 days went by in a flash. Void was having fun outside the volcano, playing with the snake. Although the snake was a little too big, he didn't have any issues with playing with it. Besides, he didn't have anything to do. They've gone through the entire island, and the only rank 6 magical beast had been bullied by the duo. It was lucky to get away thanks to some distraction. The triplet were done with their training, and they were currently sitting under a tree, watching Void and the snake. Boom! The volcano vibrated, accompanied by a loud explosion. Gray's figure shot out from the top of the volcano. He was currently sitting on a large lotus. Run! It's going to blow! He yelled at the others. Void got on the snake and tapped it twice. It immediately flew into the air, preparing to leave. The triplet appeared on its second head with the help of the space elementalist among them. Void vanished from the head of the snake and appeared on the lotus Gray was using to escape. Fancy and shiny, I like it, he commented. Gray looked at him with his eyes, and for a brief second, his eyes turned pale blue, sending chills down Void's spine. Stop that, it's freaking me out, Void complained. Gray chuckled before looking away. His eyes returned to normal and smiled happily. His gains from this trip was immense. To begin with, he still had the floating clover which brought him out. In addition, Void broke through to the Sage Plane, and he also got to the peak of the Overlord Plane after acquiring an insane ability. He started to feel that his luck wasn't as bad as he thought it was. Klaus had always been the lucky one, but looks like spending some time with them recently gave him some luck. If he was fast enough on his return, he could get his points, which he wouldn't need to waste on a cultivation room any longer. Given how the lotus was, he decided it was best to keep it hidden. So he went to the other head of the snake, sitting down with Void by his side. What did that thing give you? Void asked curiously. Want to try it out? Gray asked with a cunning smile. We'll get opponents soon enough, you'll use it against them. Void sensed something was wrong, so he immediately declined. Gray laughed before looking away. He decided to check out what his current elemental grade were. His main focus was his fire and darkness elemental grades, since they were the ones he got things for. Unfortunately, he couldn't sit down and try to understand the profoundness from the essence Void absorbed. Had he been able to watch it for some time, he was confident in being able to increase at least one of his other elemental grades. He quickly entered the chaos space and went straight to check his elemental grade. After placing his hand on the stone and it followed the same routine, the result was out. Gray focused on only 2, since the others had the same result. His darkness elemental grade shot up to the cyan elemental grade. As for his fire elemental grade, it was currently giving off a bright emerald color. After this elemental grade was the black or white elemental grade. This means that Gray's current fire elemental grade was already at the peak of what everyone knew. His darkness element was not too far behind. When he came out of the chaos space, his eyes shone with brilliance. He didn't think that things will go this well. In fact, he was elated. If not for the danger, he wouldn't mind getting in this situation more often. 3 days later. Permanent faction. Mission Hall. The young lady in charge was currently sitting down, bored. She was tired since there was nothing to do here. Originally, she would have left already and let someone else take up the task of commissioning the missions, but a certain arrogant young man took up a dangerous mission, and she wanted to see where his arrogance would lead him. The time frame for the mission was 2 weeks. This was the last day. If the young man didn't come to report the success of the mission, or even his status, someone would head out to locate him with his badge, then the mission would also be regarded as failed. It was already almost sunset. Arrogant people never last, she said with a shake of her head. There was a hint of pity in her eyes. Gray was part of her faction, so she naturally didn't want him to die so young. While she was still thinking about how Gray died, she noticed a shadow walk up to her. I'm done with the mission, a soft voice said, a little emotionlessly. Who? She raised her head to look at the figure. When her eyes met with the face of the speaker, she stood up from her seat, eyes wide open from disbelief. Impossible, she muttered. Hello, the mission. Gray waved his hand in front of the young lady who didn't seem to be in her right state of mind. The young lady stayed silent, still in shock. Gray tapped on her shoulder, trying to wake her up from whatever thought she was stuck in. The mission, I'd like my points now. He handed his badge as well as the floating clover to the young lady. She took the item and after confirming it was what was stated in the mission, she transferred the points over to Gray's badge. She remained quiet even after Gray walked out of the mission hall. Only after she couldn't see Gray's figure did she finally come back to her senses. He actually completed the mission. But how? She questioned. As long as Gray walked over to the poison miasma, he would meet certain death. However, this particular plant only grows in a place like that. Unless... She opened her eyes wide, he already had it. She smacked the table, as if she caught a thief. Such a sneaky move. He waited till the last day to make it seem like he truly went for the mission. She snorted with a sense of comfort. To her, she just saw through Gray's ruse. If Gray knew what she was thinking, he wouldn't even bother telling her she was wrong. He preferred when people think whatever they wanted about him. Chapter 836. Getting back to the faction, Gray didn't have much to do. His elemental grade increased, he was at the peak of the Overlord plane, Void was in the Sage plane, he got a new Sage plane magical beast pet, and there were also signs from the triplet that they would be breaking through to the Sage plane as well. All in all, his current target was getting to the Sage plane as well. With the points he got from the mission, he read as many books as he could on arrays to improve his knowledge of arrays. He currently had an issue he couldn't neglect. Void has gotten to the Sage plane, but what if he was accidentally found by an elemental venerable necromancer? He would lose his life without even being able to blink. Void was no different as well. They might stand a chance against a Sage plane elementalist, but against an elemental venerable, they were no match for them. His best choice right now is to improve himself. Also, most of the people his age here were already on the Sage plane. Those who were not in the Sage plane were considered fairly talented, but they can't be compared with those on a higher plane. In Gray's house. I should try speaking with the others. It's been so long. He thought before bringing out his communication device. Since they separated, he had only spoken with them on one occasion, that was a few weeks before he entered the realm of the Horned race. They didn't even know he was part of a faction at present. The second he sent his consciousness into the communication device, his head was flooded with messages. He almost fainted from the inflow of messages. Most of them were from Klaus and Reynolds, naturally, while Alice and Kyle occasionally checked up on him. He first replied to Kyle and Alice since they had fewer messages. He started replying to Reynolds and Klaus after he was done with that. It didn't even take long before Reynolds sent another message, yelling at him for not replying sooner. Klaus and Alice did the same as well. Gray chuckled when he heard their worried voices. They continued speaking, and when they found out he was officially part of a faction, they were elated. Thinking of Gray's mark, they all wanted him to stay inside the faction and train. With Gray's talent, they were more than 100% certain that he would be able to break through to the Sage plane in at most 6 months. They all spoke of their journeys so far. Klaus was already at the peak of the Overlord plane as well, while Alice and Reynolds were in the late stages. Their speed stunned Gray. He was the one with a higher elemental grade, yet his friends were advancing almost at the same pace as he was. Klaus was even more freakish, he was advancing quicker than the rest of them. Could their elemental grades be increasing as well? A thought came to Gray, but he didn't know how to confirm how accurate it was. This was the only reason he could think of. Either that or the stalled growth in the Azure continent was currently exploding from them. Either way, they were advancing faster than normal. Gray didn't forget to mention his adventure to the Horned race's realm, and also Void's breakthrough to the Sage plane. Before he knew it, they had been speaking for hours. He just decided to spend the day speaking with his friends, since after this, he wouldn't be able to talk to them for a while once he focuses on his array training. According to what he found out recently, an expert array master in the faction usually trains others once a month, and thankfully, it was free. The class would be taking place in 2 days, so he wanted to continue growing his knowledge before then. When he was done speaking with his friends, he went over to Keith's place, and he didn't find him inside. He guessed he must have left for a mission or something. He found a way to make sure he knew he had returned before going back to his place. 2 days later, Gray came out of his place, heading in the direction of the array class. He still hadn't seen Keith yet, but he wasn't really worried. Getting to the array class, he found around 50 youths present. Most youths don't have an interest in arrays since it requires a large amount of time to get an actual good result from it. The elder soon came along. She was middle-aged, with her blonde hair falling almost to her waist. She quickly started the class, and Gray made sure not to get distracted. He was still in the class when he got a message from Void. Keith had returned, and his condition was not the best. According to what Void told him, Keith was attacked, and he even had to expend a lot of effort to escape with his life, but he sustained serious injuries. Gray was forced to leave the class and head back to his place. At Keith's house. What happened? Gray asked the moment he entered, tossing one of the remaining 2 healing tonics he had with him. Keith took it, and without checking it, gulped half of it and returned the rest. Gray motioned for him to keep it. Remember those guys from the trial? Keith asked. The 3 that wanted you dead? Gray tried to confirm if they were speaking of the same people. Keith nodded before narrating what happened to Gray. Apparently, they followed him out of the faction when he was completing a mission and tried to end his life. He was fortunate to get help from a stranger walking by, hence he managed to escape. Gray thought about the issue and felt Keith was stuck in a difficult position. Since the trio were part of the faction, and given the unity policy in the faction, he couldn't walk up to them for a fight. After thinking about it for some time, he decided it would be best to send the triplet after them. He would track them down, and when next they leave the faction, the triplet will take care of them. Unfortunately, if he released them in the faction, the old monsters would sense it since they were unauthorized people. Chapter 837. Gray and Keith decided to work out a plan. Void brought the idea of beating them up in the faction, but Gray and Keith were against it mainly because of the fact that conflict was forbidden in the faction grounds. There are places where they spar, but the faction ensures that no one dies from these. After coming up with multiple plans, the best option they could come up with was simple. Keith would head out for a mission, and Void would go along, accompanied by the 2-headed snake. Once they were outside, the snake would kill them. Keith thought it was a good plan, so did Void. Although he was a little downcast that he didn't get the chance to kill them, he was happy as long as they were dead. Gray wanted to go back for his array class. Unfortunately, it was over. He couldn't help but curse at the trio who attacked Keith. When thinking about it, he suddenly recalled the young lady who sent people after him. He managed to get the location of where she stays from the men she sent after her. She was from a mid-level family, and the strongest person from her family was in an elemental venerable. Now Gray understood why she could only send Overlord Plane elementalists after him. She must have had a lot of potential, hence the family agreed to this. Unfortunately, they miscalculated. Gray decided to make more communication devices and handed them over to the triplet. He sent them out to gather information about the young lady. When next he was traveling, he didn't mind paying her a visit. Well, if it was along the path he's taking, then he would; if not, then he would focus on his mission. He also gave one to Keith. This way they could speak more frequently whenever they were not in the faction. Although Gray doesn't use his often, it's still better than not speaking at all. Bringing out his tracking device, he looked at the light dots before fixing his gaze on one that was further away from the rest. I wonder how he's doing? He thought as he stared at Ellis' light dot. Since going back to the Azure continent, he hadn't been in contact with Ellis. Even after coming back, he still couldn't get to him. The distance between them was massive, so it was natural. After going back, he checked up on Keith before going back to his place to focus on his arrays. He knew as long as he continued trying, there's a chance that he might just come up with a good idea to help seal the mark on him. 3 days later, Keith was back to normal, and he took up another mission. Gray originally wanted to accompany him since he was bored, but thinking about the fact that the young man leading them would retreat once he saw him, he decided against it. Void, on the other hand, was very enthusiastic about the mission. He had been bored for some time now. Other than when he played with the snake, he hadn't been able to have any fun. He preferred when they were traveling. Keith took up the mission and left the faction as planned. Void was with him the whole time. When they got to a forest some kilometers away from the faction, the trio stepped out once again. This time, there was a man with them. Sage Plane. Void noticed the plane of the man the moment he appeared. The man was in the early stages of the Sage Plane, the second stage to be precise. The snake had no issues with dealing with him, much less Void. What is the meaning of this? You attacked me last time, now you're here again. Keith pretended to be afraid. You managed to survive, yet you foolishly came out again even after knowing we are after your life. I never knew you were this dumb. The leader of the trip mocked. The man who stepped forward looked at them before saying, "End this quickly, I have matters to attend to." Yes. The trio nodded before attacking Keith. Void stepped forward when this happened. You three never know when to take a break, do you? He waved his paws and sent all three of them flying with a single attack. The man reacted quickly and managed to stop them from getting hurt. He looked at Void with a surprised gaze. A rank 6 beast, and since you can speak, I guess you're one with a high bloodline. Come with us, this kid has nothing. The man said slowly. Will you be able to take care of me? Even your family can't take care of me. Void mocked. The man was irritated by Void's words, but he calmed himself. If he could bring back such a magical beast back, it would be a good thing for their family. A beast of your caliber deserves the best, we will naturally treat you the best we can. I know my family is lowly, but we can assure your continuous growth. The man tried convincing Void. I'm not interested in small fries like you people. If you can defeat me, I might consider it. Void said with a proud smile. The man nodded with a smile. All right, I appreciate the opportunity. I won't waste it. Void chuckled before saying, You're not my type. Also, you're not my match. He waved his hand and the gigantic two-headed snake appeared. Keith was frozen solid from fright as he saw the snake. He was scared shitless. From the aura the snake was emanating, he could tell it was on the same level as the man in front of him. Where the hell did they get this from? He couldn't help but ask. Void was chuckling when he saw the expression of the man. He knew the man never expected something like this to happen. This is why I love going out. The man gulped down, and before he could even say anything, the snake attacked. Chapter 838. Boom! Bam! The snake and the man exchanged blows, but within a few minutes, the man was on the back foot. He was no match for the snake. At this moment, he realized the best thing to do was to escape. Void would naturally not allow this to happen. He used his space domain to block the space around them, making it impossible for the man to escape. The snake continued its assault on it. After almost 10 minutes, the man was finally defeated with Void's help. Although the snake was stronger than the man, it was unable to kill the man on its own. If not for Void, the man wouldn't have any issues with escaping. Killing me will only make matters worse for him, the man said as he struggled to get on his feet. Will you be affected by it? Void turned to Keith. They're already trying to kill me, what else is worse than that? Keith shrugged, giving Void the go-ahead to kill the man. You little runt, after everything I've done for you, this is how you choose to repay me? The man questioned Keith angrily. You came trying to kill me, I see no reason in feeling sad that you'll die. This will mean one enemy out. Keith didn't feel bothered by the man's words. The man wanted to continue pleading, but Void had seen and heard enough. A black orb appeared on the back of the man, and he started to break apart. This was his spatial distortion skill. The attack had grown stronger with the increase in his rank. The trio watched on as the man disappeared from existence. Their eyes wide open from disbelief, the man followed them to ensure that Keith was killed. However, he was the first person to die. How ironic. Void turned to look at the trio when the man disappeared completely. Now, back to you three. They shivered from his gaze, clearly afraid he would kill them. Please, we are only following instructions, don't kill us. The leader of the trio fell on his knees and started begging. The others followed his lead and also started to beg as well. They couldn't be bothered with their pride. As long as they lived, they would do anything. Void turned to look at Keith, and he could feel an intense killing intent coming from him. My hands are tied. I really wanted to let you guys live, but as you can see, I'm only following orders as well. Void said with a chuckle. Anyone would know he was only saying this for fun. The trio could only watch as their bodies started to disintegrate. Void's method of killing people was quite unique. There is not even a speck of dust from the person to indicate that he was there in the first place. Keith watched on as the trio vanished. If he wasn't with Void, he wouldn't have known that they were dead. What now? Void asked after killing the trio. It hadn't even been up to 2 hours they left the faction. He didn't want to go back so early. You can accompany me to complete my mission, Keith suggested. Having a powerful backup like Void with him was reassuring. At least he wouldn't need to be too scared about losing his life on the mission. Void thought about it for some time before nodding his head. He didn't want to go back anyway. He communicated with Gray about his intentions to accompany Keith, not forgetting to tell him that he had already killed the trio who wanted to harm Keith. Gray didn't object to him leaving with Keith. He needed some alone time to focus on his arrays anyway. Void would be bored if he returned. This mission would take at least a week, so he wanted to focus all his time and attention on arrays for now. 2 months went by in the blink of an eye. Gray had been part of the faction for over 3 months now. His progress had stalled after his last double breakthrough. Now, he was focused on getting his physical strength to the peak of the Overlord plane. After 2 months, he had managed to get it to the 9th stage, but he hadn't been able to advance again. With the help of his gravitational force field, training his physical body was easier than before. But it still took time nonetheless. Void has been accompanying Keith whenever he's going out on a mission. Gray had been in the faction all this while, not bothering to go out for any missions. He was already out of points, but he was still able to research arrays with the knowledge he acquired from the books he read, as well as the class he had been going to. Hey, the faction is holding a sparring contest. Will you take part? Keith asked Gray as he walked into the place. I'm not interested. Gray shook his head. He didn't want to do anything that will make him stand out at the moment. Keeping a low profile was his objective now. This contest will bring out those who will participate in a competition held every decade between our faction and the Syphilis faction. Keith told Gray what he knew about the competition. This competition will decide who would have rights to a particular realm. It was just like what Sylvia was recruiting him for. After thinking about it, Gray still didn't want to go since he wasn't interested in those things. The only thing that tempted him was the possibility of going into the realm to cultivate. Since he was already at the peak of the Overlord plane, it would be beneficial for him to go out more often to seek a breakthrough to the next plane. I'll think about it, maybe I'll partake in it, he said after careful consideration. Oh, by the way, when's the sparring contest? Next month, Keith replied. Gray nodded and they continued speaking about something else. Keith had already decided to partake in the contest. He couldn't miss any chance to grow stronger. A month soon went by. It was the day the sparring contest was taking place. Gray was sitting in his place leisurely when he suddenly saw a figure standing in front of him. He raised his brow to look at the figure properly. It was the elder who brought him into the faction. Hello. He stood up to greet the elder. The elder nodded before looking at him. It was as if he was trying to gaze into his soul. I see you've made good advancements. The elder nodded. When Gray joined the faction, he was still in the 8th stage of 3 Overlord plane. Now in the space of 4 months, he had broken through to the peak of the Overlord plane. In fact, he knew that Gray had already broken through 3 months back since he had been monitoring him all this while. "I was lucky," Gray replied with a collected expression. "I see." The elder nodded before looking at Gray again. "Why are you here?" "Who?" Gray was taken aback by this question. "Why are you here?" the elder asked again. Gray paused and quickly understood what the elder was implying. The elder wanted to know why he wasn't taking part in this contest. He was about to explain when the elder stopped him. "I don't need to know your reason. Normally, I wouldn't be bothered with who decide to take part in a sparring contest, but this competition is very important to the faction. Of the 10 people who would be taking part in the competition, 6 has been chosen. The reason we are doing this contest is to pick out the other 4. The elder looked at Gray and continued. "With your talent, I know you're by no way weaker than the 6 people already picked out. In the Overlord plane, you have very few opponents. Added with your domain, you're almost invincible. I've recommended you to the faction leader. However, as you can already tell, no member of the faction is given special treatment, so you will still need to prove to everyone that you can partake in the competition through this contest." Gray didn't say anything and looked at the elder, unsure of what to say. He knew the elder was pleading with him to take part of the contest. The faction's training ground. It was filled to the brim with people standing around. There were platforms raised around the place for battles, and a few people could be seen fighting. Keith was currently seated some distance away from the platform, staring at the battles taking place. All the fighters were at the peak of the Overlord plane, and most of them looked to be younger than Gray. "Do you think he'll come?" he asked Void, who was with him. "I have no idea what goes through his head. He might not come. It mainly depends on his mood." Void replied with a shrug. They were still speaking when he sensed Gray's presence. He looked in the direction and saw him walking over with the elder who welcomed them into the faction. "Isn't that the elder who brought us into the faction?" He drew Keith's attention to them. "Yeah, why is he with Gray?" "Don't tell me he went to bring Gray himself?" Keith was shocked. If this was what happened, he didn't know what to think. The fact that an elder went to bring Gray himself showed how much they valued him. "It just might be," Void commented. Chapter 839. Gray walking over with the elder drew the attention of some of the people in the area. Especially among those in the elder's side, they all turned to look at Gray. There were 2 familiar faces there when Gray looked in that direction. It was the duo that witnessed his battle with the young lady and her group. He noticed a few elders looked at him with malice. From what he could guess, they were probably upset that an elder had to bring him over. There were also a few people at the peak of the Overlord plane that also looked at him. Their auras showed that they were almost on the same level as the geniuses Gray met at the gorge when he wanted to enter the Horned race's realm. Of all the people there, he found 5 which he felt were on the same level as the leader of that group. He later finds out from the elder that they were part of the 6 people who would be taking part in the competition. Gray nodded to his words before walking over to where Keith and Void were sitting. "Why is he with you?" Keith wanted to settle his curiosity. "He came over to bring me here." Gray didn't need to hide this from him, so he told him. Keith already guessed this, but he still found it almost unbelievable coming out from Gray's mouth. Gray was currently one of the few people that could draw the attention of these elders. He didn't find it odd, especially after getting to know just how powerful Gray was to begin with. Since Gray broke through, he hadn't seen him fight. But when Gray was still in the 8th stage of the Overlord plane, he could already defeat magical beasts at the peak of the Overlord plane, not any regular magical beast, but those that were regarded among the cream of the crops in their species. Gray sat down beside Keith and they continued watching the battles. The one on the platforms finished and another one started. Keith was part of this group that fought. His opponent was a peak Overlord plane wind and fire elementalist, but he was able to win in the end. When this round ended, Gray decided to step in after getting a look from the elder. He had no choice. Besides, the reward offered was quite tempting. He presently needed all the help he could get so his breakthrough would be quick. He didn't want to stay at the peak of the Overlord plane just as long as he did when he was at the peak of the Origin plane. When Gray stepped onto the platform, he naturally attracted some attention. One of the reasons was that he came alongside an elder, the second reason was that he was handsome. His opponent was a fire elementalist at the peak of the Overlord plane. But in the space of 3 minutes, he defeated him. It wasn't even seen as a battle, it was more like a thrashing. If not for Gray going easy, he would have beaten his opponent out cold. After that battle, he quickly drew the attention of most of the people in the training ground. The elders were the most focused. An elder had recommended Gray for this particular competition, so they wanted to see what he was capable of. His first battle already showed them what they wanted. He was powerful. The fact that he could defeat someone in the same plane and stage in such a short time proved this. Gray naturally couldn't be bothered with them. When he was done with his opponent, he went back to his seat. They stayed for some time before he stepped onto the platform again, and the result was the same. He dominated his opponent from the start of the battle to the end. The time was still the same, nothing more than 3 minutes. At some point, a few people had the notion of Gray bribing the others. How could someone in the same stage as them beat them so easily? It looked fake, especially since Gray was not one of the famous members at the peak of the Overlord plane. Till the end of the day, Gray continued dominating his battles, not interested with the side talks from the side. He could hear what most of the people were saying, but there was nothing he wanted to show them. The main round of the sparring contest would be taking place the next day. Only those who performed exceedingly well could take part in this stage. Keith managed to be part of this group. The elders spoke about Gray's battles, and each gave their opinions of him. Given his talent, most of them liked him. Nevertheless, they all felt he was too proud, due to the fact that he waited till an elder invited him over before taking part in the sparring contest. The next day soon came. Only 40 people made it to this round. Each participant will fight a total of 8 battles, each battle would be against 4 others. After all the battles are done, the 4 with the highest rank will get the spot in joining the other 6 for the competition. There were more than 8 platforms in total. If all 8 battles take place, this would mean all 40 participants are fighting in a group of 5. From the arrangement, one participant will not battle against someone they fought before. Gray felt it was a good plan. Even though there would be people with advantages of teaming up, they wouldn't be together forever. After one fight, they would change opponents. His first involved 2 others who were considered powerful from the previous battle. Once again, Gray dominated his battle, making him one of the most powerful people fighting. By the time Gray was done with the battles, he had already defeated all his opponents, taking first place in all 8 battles. He was the only one who managed to achieve such a feat. Chapter 840. Gray's performance stunned the elders, as well as the youths watching the battles. They never thought Gray was actually that powerful. The elder who recommended Gray had a calm expression. Since this was not his first time seeing Gray battle, the others didn't have the same expression. Each had a look of surprise on their faces. With the completion of the sparring contest, the competition would follow right after. Gray and 3 others secured the other 4 spots. Keith was unsuccessful in his attempt to fight for a good position. This was within his expectations, so he wasn't feeling too disappointed by the result. Since Gray would be taking part in the competition, he started to encourage him as much as he could. Gray was his friend, so he naturally wanted the best for him. To him, Gray had a better chance of taking a good position compared to the other geniuses at the peak of the Overlord plane. When they were done with the sparring contest, they all went back to their houses. According to what Keith and the elder told Gray, the competition would be taking place in a week's time, so they would be transported to the place in a few days. On Gray's way back to his place, he was approached by the 5 geniuses who were already part of the initial 6 that would be taking place in the competition. They invited him over for a meeting, which he accepted. He met up with the group later that day, and he was greeted with a group of around 20 people. All youths were at the peak of the Overlord plane. He searched for the people who invited him over, and sat down by their side. They spoke for the rest of the day, and Gray got to know the others who would be taking part in the competition, except for a certain talented genius. The genius was regarded as the #1 figure under the Sage Plane in the Permand faction. Unlike the others, they would be meeting him at the place of the competition. There were rumors of him having the Emerald Elemental grade, but people didn't know what his real elemental grade was. He was a dual elementalist, having the fire and space elements. Gray was a little interested in this figure who had the Emerald Elemental grade. Since there were rumors about this, the chances of it being true was quite high. Not just that, but even if he doesn't have it, he shouldn't be too far from it. Gray, for instance, currently had an Emerald Elemental grade for his fire element, and he knew his current strength was above what it used to be. It was also said that this young man had gotten entangled with a Sage Plane Elementalist, and although he didn't win, he didn't lose either. This was not an easy feat. The current Gray could naturally achieve this, but he never thought there would be people who could achieve this as well. This mainly has to do with him not encountering those geniuses that were top tier regularly. He left the gathering and went back to his place. To his surprise, he saw the elder waiting for him there. "I see you have an interest in arrays?" The elder muttered as he looked at the few marks Gray drew around the place. He was a little impressed by it, but Gray's mastery was not on his level. Gray nodded before bowing as a sign of showing his respect to the elder. The elder nodded before taking a seat. The elder spoke with him a little while, giving Void a long look. He felt there was something odd about him, but he didn't want to speak about it. Void was Gray's pet, and there was no need to ask about it. After staying for a little while, he told Gray to follow him. With a wave of his hand, they disappeared. They appeared in a hidden cave. Gray could tell that they were still at the faction ground. He looked around curiously, and sitting in front of them was a man who looked to be ordinary. He couldn't even sense any signs of elemental fluctuations around him, which he found a little suspicious. There were a few people at the side as well, from men to women. Their age range varied. Some looked to be in their late 20s, while others were middle-aged, with the rest being a little old-looking. Gray kept his mouth shut and followed the elder. "Gray Dawson, that's your name, right?" The ordinary-looking man in the middle asked when Gray walked into the place. He saw that there were a few people on the side as well. All youths, they were obviously the others who would be taking part in the competition. Seeing the others made him calm down a little. "Yes," Gray replied with a calm expression. I see," the man replied after some time. He kept quiet before speaking again, this time addressing all the youths present. "As you all know, the faction is on the decline. This realm has been one of the most vital parts in grooming talents for us. Losing it has pretty much shown on the faction. We not only lost it, but we also lost one of our strongest appeals to take in members." The man continued speaking. Gray got to find out that the realm they were fighting for originally belonged to 3 Permand faction, but after the faction suffered a calamity, the Syphilis faction used the opportunity to come into play. The Permand faction was not at its peak, so it was no match for them. They came up with the plan of fighting for the rights to the realm every decade. Still suffering from the effect of the calamity, the Permand faction lost the first battle, naturally. It has been well over 100 years now, but they still haven't been able to take it back. The man encouraged the youths who would be taking part in the competition before telling them to leave. "This batch has the most potential so far. Hopefully, they can win it." Chapter 841. Permand Faction Gate. Gray was standing beside Keith. "With those guys gone, you shouldn't have any problems in the faction. But just in case, you can keep this guy, he's pretty useful," Gray said as he passed on the 2-headed snake over to Keith. He spoke with Void about it, and Void said he had completely tamed the 2-headed snake. It still had all its freedom, but it wouldn't harm nor disobey Void or his friends. The snake was acquainted with Keith from the times they've traveled together. This made it easier for them to leave it with him. "Thank you," Keith said in gratitude. That group was his greatest fear, but he also knew that there was a chance that they would send others after him once they realized this group was dead. Leaving the snake with him was a means of helping him fight against those people who might come later on. Gray nodded before turning to look at the people stepping out of the gate. The group consisted of 15 people, 8 youths and 7 elders. He walked up to them since they would be heading to the place of the competition together. The competition usually takes place outside the realm, and there is a third party who always mediates the competition. An elder dressed in black robes made a head count, and after confirming that they were correct, he waved his hand and a powerful force sucked everyone into space and they disappeared from view. 1 hour later, they appeared in a forest. On the side of a mountain was a youth dressed in blue, sitting in a cross-legged position. His eyes were closed and it seemed as if he blended into nature itself. Gray was taken aback when he saw this youth. The aura the young man was radiating was almost identical to that of an ordinary person. But he knew otherwise. "Alec, we're leaving." The elder in black robes walked forward and said. The young man referred to as Alec opened his eyes to look around. Gray looked into the eyes of the young man and it felt as if his soul was set ablaze. However, his eyes started to glow with a pale blue flame, and the feeling stopped. Such an odd feeling. Mental attacks. He thought as he looked at Alec. Alec looked at Gray, surprised by their small exchange. He didn't attack them on purpose, it was a result of his training, but the fact that of all the youths present, Gray was the only one who didn't feel affected by it showed that he was not someone to take lightly. "All right, elder." He bowed to the elder. "So, you didn't want to come back?" asked an irritated voice from the group of youngsters. It was a young lady who looked to be around 18. She was also at the peak of the Overlord plane, just like the others. "I was held back by a small issue, but it's done now," Alec replied with a smile. He turned to the others and exchanged greetings with them. From what Gray could see, he was pretty friendly with those around. Of all the people present, Gray was the only new member of the faction that got a spot in this competition. "Hello, I'm Alec Baldwin, you are?" Alec stretched out his hand. "Gray Dawson." Gray shook his hand as he introduced himself. "Oh, you're from the Dawson family?" Alec asked with a surprised look. The Dawson family was famous across this region, so whenever someone spoke of the Dawson family, everyone thought of the same family, the one who produced an unimaginable genius. "I don't think we're speaking of the same Dawson family, but I'm from a Dawson family," Gray replied with a melancholic smile. However, he quickly hid his feelings. His family was one of the few things he had not thought about for some time now. The truth was, he couldn't really say he had given up, but given the size of the Aurora continent, it would take him years to sweep the entire continent in search of his family. Without sufficient strength, he couldn't complete it quickly. "I should visit this Dawson family they speak of." Gray added this to the list of things he would do later on. "Oh, not that Dawson family. Anyway, it's nice meeting you," Alex said before focusing on the others. Visit freenovel.cm for the best novel reading experience. The eyes of the elders which lit up when Gray spoke of being from the Dawson family died down when he said he wasn't from that Dawson family. The Dawson family are well respected in this region, and they had every right to be. The mediators for this competition are actually from the Dawson family. The elder who brought Gray into the faction whispered to the other elders. "Do you think he would be the one?" The black-robed elder asked. "I doubt that. He's not that free." The elder shook his head. After everyone settled down, the black-robed elder took them into space once again, transporting them to the place of the competition. Time went by, and a few hours later, they appeared on an open field. On getting there, an elder brought out an odd glowing rock, and the space in front of them distorted. To Gray's surprise, there was a passageway that led to somewhere else in the open field. They all stepped into the passageway and appeared close to a lake. Looking behind him, all he could see was a vast mountain range. There were already people waiting for them there. Who? Gray was a little taken aback when he saw some familiar faces. "Isn't that the guy who opened that portal?" Void asked when he saw the middle-aged man. "Yes." Gray nodded. Beside the middle-aged man was Connor, the leader of that group. He has surprisingly broken through to the Sage Plane. This wasn't much of a surprise to Gray since he expected geniuses like Connor to have no problems with breaking through. Late again. A cold snort came from the side. It's not noon yet, so I see no reason why you're grumpy. The elder who took Gray into the faction replied coldly. It was easy to see that the relationship between both factions was not good. Connor and the middle-aged man turned to look at the new arrivals. Chapter 842. The middle-aged man looked at the new arrivals and did a double-take when his eyes went past Gray, but he didn't dwell on it. Connor, on the other hand, walked over to the group and stood in front of Gray. "You're part of the permanent faction," he said after greeting the elders of the faction. Gray nodded before asking, "What are you doing here?" "I followed my uncle here, we're mediating the competition." "I'm here to learn," Connor replied. "You broke through to the Sage Plane already?" Alec's voice came from the side. "I see you're still at the peak of the Overlord Plane." Connor turned to Alec. Alec nodded with an awkward smile. "Unfortunately, yes. I know you're stopping yourself from breaking through because of this competition. If I knew he was part of your faction, I would have advised you to break through months ago." Connor pointed at Gray. "Are you too close?" Alec asked curiously. "Well, we had an encounter and helped each other out." Connor didn't go into details. "I see. I guess I shouldn't be too worried about this competition then." Alec heaved a sigh of relief. He already felt Gray was different from the rest, but after hearing Connor's words, he could tell that Gray was either as powerful as they were, if not even stronger. Connor was a very proud figure. He might be nice to people, but he wouldn't acknowledge someone who isn't as powerful as he is as a friend of his. Gray didn't join them in their conversation. He looked around, trying to see their potential opponents. This was a competition between their faction and an opposing faction. He had never encountered anyone from this syphilis faction, so he knew nothing about them. The darkness element. He felt a large amount of darkness elemental particles around them. This could only mean that all the techniques they mostly practiced was a darkness elemental technique. Thinking of the darkness element, he thought of necromancers once again. They wouldn't have any problems infiltrating such a faction. He thought to himself. While he was looking at the people from the syphilis faction, they were also staring in their direction. A few of them had menacing eyes, and even their auras were eerie. "We should head to our seats," an elder from the group said. She led the group to their seats before settling down. The middle-aged man from the Dawson family stepped forward and addressed both sides. He told them the rules of the battles and what were prohibited. Death was natural one of them. While listening to the rules, Gray couldn't help but find a problem with it. There were no rules stating that people couldn't use special techniques to increase their strengths. This was always stated in every single competition he had participated in. He spoke with Alec concerning it, and he found out the reason for this. According to what was agreed between both factions, the winner of the last round could add a rule as long as it was not too excessive. Letting them use a technique that would increase their strengths was something that would also be beneficial to the permanent faction, so they didn't stand against it. However, this has been the cause of their losses all this while. Since they've not been able to win, they weren't able to remove this rule. This has been the only rule the syphilis faction had been using so far. Gray couldn't help but chuckle when he heard this. This just gave him freedom to use his fusion state. With that, he could easily wipe out the entire group from the syphilis faction. When the man was done with the rules, Gray heard a second rule that surprised him. Once a member of a faction was eliminated, the faction would have to fight with fewer numbers. The first round of the battles was a one-on-one battle. The next round, however, consisted of a general group battle. If the permanent faction or the syphilis faction loses more than half of their people from the first round, it is easy to see who the winner is. There had been a time when the permanent faction managed to eliminate 6 of the 10 fighters from the syphilis faction. But the remaining 4 members who fought against the 6 from the permanent faction were able to win quite easily. "This is the weirdest competition I've ever taken part in," Gray said to Void. "But they've given you a better chance to shine. It's not that bad." Void chuckled. With the rules set in place, Gray was pretty much the winner. He could easily take out all 10 people from the syphilis faction with the fusion state, much less when they would have lesser numbers. Although using the fusion state wouldn't let his plane jump to the Sage plane, his strength would be well over the Overlord plane. When the man was done addressing both parties, he called for the start of the battles. Alec was the first person to step on the platform. He wanted to get the first win to ensure that their faction's morale was high going into the next battle. His opponent was a dual elementalist who had the darkness and space elements. Alec was purely a fire elementalist, and he was one of the strongest fire elementalist in the Overlord plane Gray had seen in his life. Alec's powers were something that stunned Gray. He never thought that there was someone in the Overlord plane that was actually this powerful. If he really has the Emerald Elemental grade, it should be expected. He thought to himself as he watched Alec beat his opponent. A few minutes later, he was victorious. Alec returned to their seats, and he was congratulated by the others. Gray felt he made the wrong decision in stepping out too early. He was famous, so the syphilis faction would send someone who wasn't powerful among their group to fight against him. The next person from the syphilis faction stepped out, and someone from the permanent faction stepped out to fight against him. In the end, the person from the syphilis faction won the battle, quite easily. Chapter 843. This is bad. An elder from the permanent faction muttered when they watched their 6th member lose to a member of the syphilis faction. The other elders nodded with a sour expression. The geniuses the syphilis faction brought out this time were a notch better than theirs. In fact, if not for Alec's impressive strength, he might have lost, but since he dominated his opponent, they never got to see his opponent's power. There had been 7 battles so far, and the permanent faction had won just one of them. This was not something that any of them felt was possible. The middle-aged man from the Dawson family looked at the members of the permanent faction, before looking at those from the syphilis faction once again. It was unknown what was going through his mind. Connor was sitting with Gray, Alec was beside them, his expression was just as sour as that of the elders. Gray was the only one who didn't have a change of expression. "How do you guys plan to win now?" Connor asked Alec. "We will win," Alec said confidently. "You do know you're the only one who has won, right?" Connor knew Alec had very little confidence at this moment. "Yes, but we'll win the rest." Alec nodded. "Even if you win the rest, you'll have only 4 members, against 6 of them. The odds are not in your favor," Connor replied. He was closer with the permanent faction and naturally wanted them to win, but he couldn't deny the fact that the syphilis faction's geniuses were above those from the permanent faction. "We still have him, he would be helpful." Alec turned to Gray. Since Connor thought highly of Gray, then Gray was definitely not a weakling. He should be able to handle 2 people on his own. They turned to look at Gray and they realized his facial expression was the same as when they arrived. He didn't seem angry or excited, he just wore a blank face. "Hey, Gray, why don't you go up next?" Alec suggested. "All right." Gray stood up and walked to the platform. His steps were steady but fast. Before long, he was standing on the platform. A young lady jumped onto the platform with a smirk on her face. She looked at Gray with a demeaning look. "Give up now, and I'll spare you," she said coldly. Gray looked into her eyes and turned to look at the middle-aged man from the Dawson family, waiting for him to start the battle. While Gray and the young lady were about to face off, the crowd from the permanent faction had a worried expression. "Isn't that Lydia?" one of the youths asked. "It's her. I never thought she would hold back as well." Alec's expression turned even worse when he saw this young lady. He hadn't seen her all this while, but seeing her now made him realize how bad things were for him. Lydia was a famous young genius in the region. Everyone thought she had broken through to the Sage plane some months back. Well, this was the news the syphilis faction spread out. "Will your friend be able to cope with her?" Alec turned to look at Connor. "He will win," Connor replied. He had seen Gray's strength, so he knew for a fact that even though Lydia was powerful, he wouldn't take anything away from Gray. "So confident." We'll see how things go. Alec turned to the battle that was about to start. Connor wasn't the only person who felt Gray would win. The elder who took Gray into the faction was also very confident in him. He watched Gray fight against 10 people on his own, so he was sure Gray wouldn't have any problems with fighting against Lydia on his own. This elder knew that as long as Gray progressed to the next round, then they would win. Gray and Alec combining would be a force the Syphilis faction aren't prepared for. Begin! Gray's figure moved the moment he heard this, but he wasn't attacking, rather, he was dodging an attack that sprouted out from the ground. As his figure shot into the air, black tendrils like tentacles chased after him and one managed to get a hold of his leg. Just as it was dragging him to the ground, Gray made a fire sword that he used to cut the tendril. After cutting that one, the others tried to wrap themselves around him, but he exploded out with a powerful fire outburst that broke all the tendrils. He looked at Lydia and attacked, using a meteor descent. Lydia created a thin veil made entirely from the darkness element and used it to block the attack that was coming her way. The veil surprisingly didn't have any issues with blocking Gray's attacks. Gray didn't feel bothered by this. He used his lightning element to send out a powerful thunderbolt bolt that struck the veil, causing cracks on it. The second thunderbolt managed to break through the defense of the veil. Lydia retreated to ensure she wasn't hit by the thunderbolt. For elements, no wonder you're so confident, she said before preparing for another attack. Gray didn't say anything. Instead, he moved his hands quickly and created an array in the sky. The array was made entirely from fire elemental particles, and it started spitting out powerful fireballs, as well as fire arrows and spears. Gray continued attacking with his lightning element. He hadn't used the space element so far. The battle continued. Lydia was not able to gain the upper hand, contrary to what most of the people there expected. Things were the other way around. Gray was actually the one dominating the battle since it started. Gray was just like Lydia, at the peak of the Overlord plane. However, Gray was more powerful. This was something none of those from the Syphilis faction expected. Lydia was their strongest member at the peak of the Overlord plane. The reason they brought her out to fight against Gray was because they've heard about him. During the contest, he was the brightest, so they planned to take him out, making sure Alec was isolated in the final round. Chapter 844. Did we make a mistake in sending her out now? An elder from the Syphilis faction looked at his comrades when he saw Gray dominating their strongest member in the Overlord plane. Lydia hasn't gone all out yet. I believe she's waiting for the right time. A lady among the elders replied softly. I know, but this isn't good for the others. The elder said. What matters is that she wins, not how long it takes for her to win. The lady replied, her voice still soft. The others looked at the platform and they noticed something. A look of realization appeared on their faces. I see. The elder nodded with squinted eyes before focusing fully on the battle. The youths from the Syphilis faction were watching the battle with a surprised expression. The look of disbelief in their eyes was too evident. They never thought that someone who was unknown would be able to dominate their strongest member. While the morale for those from the Syphilis faction was a little shaken, that of the Permand faction slowly started to pick up. Losing 6 battles in a round naturally took its toll on the mental strength of the group. However, watching Gray beat the strongest person in the Overlord plane from the Syphilis faction was satisfying, and also very encouraging. Now they knew Alec was not the only powerful figure in their ranks. Gray was also in that category, if not even higher. The elders were impressed with Gray's performance as they watched him battle. Gray and Lydia were still exchanging blows. Gray managed to send her flying, and she crashed into the ground, almost leaving the platform. Before she could get back up, Gray attacked once again, forcing her back. She sensibly got away from the edge of the platform. She couldn't afford to let Gray defeat her. Gray wanted to continue his assault, but he sensed something and backed away instantly. A black orb exploded and spread black particles across the entire platform. Even though Gray succeeded in retreating, he was still pushed back by the explosion. He looked at the black particles around and his expression changed slightly. When it dropped on his body, it started to wreak havoc in his body. What is this? He was stunned. Even a poison miasma would not affect him, yet he was being affected by an attack from this young lady. It was a darkness element attack, so he felt he wouldn't be troubled by it, but things aren't always what they seem. He used his darkness elemental essence in his body to try to control it, but the moment it touched it, he felt a stinging pain all over his body and he jolted from it. Damn it! He looked at his opponent, and he could see her smiling evilly. You're mine now. Lydia licked her lips with a flirtatious smile before attacking. This time, she used the water element to attack. Gray prepared to attack, but the moment he mobilized his elemental essence, he felt a stinging pain in his head and he couldn't help but hold his head from the pain. Lydia's attack hit Gray, who wasn't even able to set up a defensive wall. It sent him flying, crashing into the ground. I can't use my elemental essence. Gray hurriedly stood up and dodged the ice spikes that came out from the ground. This was one of the most difficult positions he had been in. The technique Lydia used made it difficult for him to even try to block using his elemental powers. Lydia continued attacking, not giving Gray an opportunity to think. Gray was forced to move around, dodging all the attacks. Luckily, his physical speed was still very fast, so he could still barely keep up with Lydia's attacks. He tried to shorten the gap between them so he could send her out of the platform, but unfortunately, Lydia didn't give him that chance. Those from the Permanent faction looked at Gray's current plight in worry. They originally thought Gray would lose, but after watching him battle Lydia, they started to feel hopeful, especially when Gray almost knocked Lydia out of the platform. But now, things were different. Gray wasn't scrambling around the platform trying to keep himself in the platform, he was even unable to defend. What's happening? One of the geniuses who had been defeated asked, worried. They didn't know why Gray was unable to even block the attacks. They saw him holding his head all of a sudden, but they didn't know why. It's the Syphilis faction's technique. Once one was inflicted by it, they would be unable to mobilize their elemental powers, or they risk suffering from a severe backlash. An elder explained to the others. Isn't there a way to counter it? Alec asked. There is, but none of you have gotten to that level yet. Normally, an elementalist below the sage plane shouldn't be able to learn that technique. I guess Lydia is a generational genius. The elder shook his head with a sigh. Gray and Alec were their strongest members. Now Gray was about to be eliminated from the competition. This is a little difficult, but you don't think that he doesn't have any hidden cards, do you? Connor still had some faith in Gray's ability. Even if he does, without his elemental essence, he can't possibly win against her. I mean, wait a minute, how come he's that fast without using elemental essence? Alec was in the middle of speaking when he realized something odd. Gray's speed didn't see a considerable reduction after being unable to use his elements. Gray was moving almost as fast as a wind elementalist at the 9th stage of the Overlord plane, and it wasn't something normal. After Alec brought this observation to light, the others also realized it as well. Gray was dodging the attacks and even trying to close the gap between himself and Lydia. This was not supposed to be possible without his elements. I knew he had a hidden card. Still so fast without an element. Connor said. He saw Gray fight against one of the members of the Horned race with his fists, so he knew of his monstrous physical prowess, but he didn't know it was on this level. Chapter 845. Boom! Gray's figure crashed into the ground, almost sliding off the platform. He managed to keep himself on the platform with his hands and forcefully used his elemental essence, suffering a backlash from the technique Lydia used. When he stood on the platform, he was breathing heavily, trying to catch his breath. Lydia was a difficult opponent, and this was a challenge he had been waiting for a long time now. Her elemental grade shouldn't be below cyan. He thought internally as he looked at her. You're quite amazing, most people would have been eliminated by now. Lydia wasn't feeling pressured by Gray any longer, so she didn't mind speaking with him for some time before she defeats him. Even if Gray had impressed her so far, she was still 100% confident that she would be able to defeat him. Since she had used this technique, she felt she was already the victor of the battle. Gray looked at her. You're not bad yourself. Ha ha, I'd like to see how long you'll be able to keep that calm expression on your face. Lydia chuckled before attacking once again. Gray retreated quickly, dodging the attack that Lydia sent his way. After dodging, he tried to close the gap, but Lydia didn't give him the chance. I can still use my elemental essence 2 more times, that's my limit. Either I take her out or I lose, either way, I have no choice. He thought after dodging the attack. When he used his elemental essence previously, he realized he could use it 2 more times, so he started to plan on how to use it to defeat Lydia. After careful consideration, he could only think of one plan. He would use his space element to appear beside her and attack her with his physical strength. If he failed, he would wait for another chance to use his last effort. This was his best bet. If he tried to attack her with an elemental attack and failed on the first try, then he would have wasted his chance to defeat her. Lydia continued her attack, dominating the battle. She didn't feel any pressure from fighting against Gray. To her, this was nothing more than a spar with an inanimate object. She was still in the process of assaulting Gray when his figure suddenly flashed. Before she knew it, he was standing in front of her, and he threw a fist at her. She quickly used the water element to create an ice wall in front of her to block the attack. Gray's fist broke through the ice wall and almost hit her, but she prepared another defensive wall made from the darkness element. Even though it managed to stop Gray's fist, she was still pushed back by it. She slid back and looked at Gray with a surprised expression. "Impossible!" she exclaimed, unable to believe that Gray was able to actually mobilize his elemental essence, neglecting the backlash. She wasn't the only one who was surprised by this turn of events. All the elders from the Syphilis faction, as well as the Permanent faction elders, couldn't believe that Gray managed to use his elemental essence after Lydia used that ultimate technique. The elders from the Permanent faction couldn't help but feel a hint of hope. Gray shocked them, and they hoped he could continue shocking them. Lydia was still trying to regain her footing when Gray's figure appeared beside her, throwing a fist at her. She was unable to set up a defensive wall, so she used her elemental essence to enhance the strength in her hand and tried to block Gray's punch by crossing her hands in front of her. When Gray's fist connected with her hands, she realized she made a terrible mistake. She was sent flying, like a kite. Gray rushed after her once again, not wanting to give her the chance to separate them with her elemental attacks. Lydia's figure didn't even get to the platform before Gray appeared in front of her once again. He continued attacking, but this time, she used something Gray hadn't seen before. The space element. She vanished from where Gray appeared and arrived on another side of the platform, keeping a good distance from Gray. When Gray saw her use the space element, he almost couldn't believe his eyes. The fact that she hid her space element this long showed how cunning she was. This has spoiled his plans of being able to defeat her with this particular assault. 3 elements, what else is she hiding? Gray looked at Lydia. Now, he knew to be cautious around her. At this rate, he didn't know how many elements she had. If he made a wrong decision when using his second chance, then he would lose his opportunity of a surprise attack, leaving him in a difficult position. At the camp of the Permanent faction, the members who were getting excited when Gray managed to get close to Lydia were also shocked by her using another element. Even the elders from the faction didn't see this coming. "She has a 4th element?" one of the elders asked in shock. "I'm just as amazed as you. I never thought she had this element as well." The elder shook his head with a wry smile. They've always known Lydia had 3 elements, darkness, water, and wind element. This was their first time knowing of her 4th element, so it was a surprise to them. The elders from the Syphilis faction didn't find this as a surprise since they already knew. The younger members, however, felt shocked. They thought they knew Lydia, only now did they realize they didn't know much about her. Lydia chuckled and looked at Gray. "You just can't cease to amaze me, can you?" "I can say the same about you." Gray looked at her with a serious expression. He couldn't take this battle lightly any longer. From not being able to use his elemental essence, to not being able to predict the next action of his opponent. If Lydia had the elements he felt she had, he would have won by now, but unfortunately, she used a trick he was very familiar with. Chapter 846. Gray dodged an attack, but he was still pushed back by the impact of the attack. Lydia on the other hand knew that she couldn't afford to play with Gray any longer. A small slip-up and Gray would capitalize on it. She had seen it from Gray's effort of almost eliminating her a few minutes ago. As the battle progressed, she started to feel a little annoyed. She didn't let it cloud her judgment, but she was irritated at the sight of Gray. No matter what she tried to do, she had been unable to send him out of the platform or knock him out. At first, she thought after using the ultimate technique, she would be the winner, but Gray was a tough nut to crack. "I like opponents like you," she muttered under her breath. Her expression was one of anger. She continued attacking Gray, but whenever she was close to eliminating him, he would find a way to survive. Gray was very technical when defending and attacking. He made sure to plan how he would defend very precisely. This way, even if she managed to force him back, he still escaped. She tried to calm her mind. After all, she had the upper hand in the battle. Gray on the other hand decided to employ Klaus tactics. Since he couldn't use his elements, and Lydia wasn't giving him the chance to get close to her, he wanted to annoy her so she would make a bad decision. He dodged an attack and mocked, "You can't even beat someone who isn't using his elements. Some genius you are." When Lydia heard his words, she was infuriated and increased the intensity of her attacks. Gray focused mainly on dodging and blocking. Although he was pushed back by the attacks whenever he tried to block them, he made sure he wasn't anywhere near the edge of the platform. He used this to continue mocking Lydia while also trying to shorten the gap between them. When he saw that she was at her peak when it came to being angry, he decided it was time to use the last chance he got in using his elemental essence. He still didn't know why this worked on him, but he was going to make sure he thought of a way to not make this happen a second time. His figure blinked, and even though Lydia was able to sense the ripples in space, it was still too late. Gray attacked the moment he appeared. Even though he was using his physical strength, it wasn't something Lydia could neglect. She managed to set up a defensive wall, but it was useless against Gray, since he broke it quite easily. She made a second wall, but she was still sent flying. Gray didn't let the chance go and rushed after her. His figure was about to reach her when he noticed a slight change in her body. Before he could move back, he was picked up by a tornado and thrown into the air. If he had his elements, he could easily stop this, but without his elements, he was unable to stop it. He was picked up into the air, and while trying to keep himself protected, he felt a sharp pain in his back. He winced as he tried to open his eyes. Before him was a smiling Lydia. "You know, I feel you're more dangerous than Alec, so if I can, I want to end you here." She smiled as she looked into Gray's eyes. Gray didn't let her words get to him. He had never been afraid of anyone before, well, except his mother. Even when fighting against those in a plane above him, he was not scared, much less someone in the same plane. He continued protecting himself as he tried to force his body down. With his body mid-air, he couldn't move it properly. Since he didn't have his elements at the moment, he was almost a sitting duck. Lydia attacked his back since he wasn't able to protect that part of his body. Gray felt immense pain from the attacks. Unfortunately, there was nothing he could do about it. The elders, as well as the members from the Permanent faction, looked on with worried expressions. Gray opened his eyes, and they glowed with a pale blue light. When Lydia looked into his eyes, she froze, unable to move. The attack stopped and Gray's figure came crashing down, along with hers. The audience were shocked by this. They didn't know what happened all of a sudden. Lydia was obviously ahead, however she fell down, along with Gray. What could have happened? The elders from both factions were shocked, never expecting a change to occur in the battle. They looked at both fighters with a strange expression before they all looked at Gray as if staring at a monster. Mental attacks. He could use mental attacks as well? An elder from the Syphilis faction couldn't help but ask. There was no information of him being able to use mental attacks. What the hell is going on? The elder exclaimed. I guess we aren't the only ones with secrets. Another elder said. Look at them, do they look like they know as well? An elder pointed at the elders from the Permanent faction. The elders all have a shocked expression, just like the elders from the Syphilis faction. This meant that they had no idea of Gray's mental attack ability. If this was what they felt it was, then Gray kept his trump cards hidden from even those at his faction. With this thought, they couldn't help but wonder where Gray came from. They did their research on Gray, but nothing spoke of him having a mental attack. Gray was becoming a problem for them. The elders from the Permanent faction looked at Gray with surprised and shocked expression. "Did you know he had mental attacks as well?" They turned to the elder who brought him into the faction. "I had no idea." The elder replied. Chapter 847. Both fighters were currently sprawled on the ground, none of them moving. The onlookers were anxious and a little excited, well, just those from the Permanent faction. Gray's ability to attack Lydia when all hope was lost is something they never expected. There had been too many twists in the battle, and they didn't think Gray would get any chances of ever winning again after he was affected by Lydia's special attack. Gray opened his eyes to look around. He was dead exhausted from taking too many attacks from Lydia. Even when he tried to defend to his fullest, he was still hit by many of her attacks. "This girl is something," he commented before trying to stand up. He could feel all his body ache from the pain of the battle. It would take him some time before he recovered, and this would affect the next round of battles. "I still have some of the liquid left, guess I have no choice but to use it," he thought as he tried to stand up. While he was on his knees, he saw Lydia looking at him. His eyes glowed instantly and Lydia screamed in pain. She was still trying to recover from the previous attack. Gray attacking once again made the pain unbearable for her. Gray knew she was defeated, yet since the effect of her special attack was still on, the moment the effect stops, he would be assured that he had defeated her. He got to his feet and walked over to her, looking down at her while she tried to stand up once again. "You're powerful, but not my match," he said calmly. Lydia gritted her teeth as she looked at him. When she saw Gray's eyes starting to glow once again, she hastily shut her eyes. Gray smiled when he saw this and kicked her. She was still on the ground, so when he kicked her, she was sent sliding on the ground. The kick took her from one side of the platform to the other side. She screamed in pain once again. Gray didn't hold back when he kicked her, so she felt a sharp pain in her stomach. The onlookers looked at Gray, a little appalled. Lydia was a lady, however, Gray didn't seem to be treating her as one. He walked over to her once again and tried to kick her. She placed a defensive wall around her body, but Gray kicked it twice, and it started to shatter. The strength of Gray's blow or kick is not something that should be taken gently. The audience were in a state of shock as they watched Gray literally kicking Lydia around like a rag doll. He wasn't even holding back in the slightest. All the young men from the Syphilis faction stood up in anger, never expecting Gray to be so cruel. The young ladies from the Permanent faction were a little taken aback, not knowing if to applaud Gray or not. They felt he was a little too aggressive and cruel. "This guy is really something," Alex said with an awkward smile. To be honest, he wouldn't do something like this. "She's his opponent, what do you expect him to do?" Connor didn't see anything wrong with what Gray was doing. He wasn't the only one with this view, all the elders also felt this was normal. Gray and Lydia were enemies, so he didn't have to go easy on her. When she had the upper hand, she was still beating Gray up as well. While they were all speaking about the matter, Gray continued his vicious assault. Lydia was already bleeding from her head, mouth, and even her nose and ears. Her current appearance was miles apart from how she looked like when she stepped onto the platform. After a few more kicks, she tried to use the space element to create some distance between herself and Gray. But before she could escape into the spatial tunnel, Gray threw a punch into the spatial tunnel. One punch, laced with destructive power. The spatial tunnel started to shake vigorously. Lydia was forced to close it. Entering that would endanger her life. At this point, she didn't know how to fight against Gray. She couldn't create a space between them, and if she tried to open her eyes, Gray would use his mental attacks. For Gray's attacks, he needed eye contact before he could employ it. As long as she closed her eyes, she was safe from it. However, doing that would mean she couldn't fight against him. She had tried using her spiritual senses, but it was affected when Grey attacked her the first time. Presently, she was blind. "Aren't you ashamed? You're fighting a blind opponent," a young man from the Syphilis faction yelled from the other side. "When she fought against a defenseless opponent, why didn't you speak out?" A young lady from the Permanent faction retorted with a smile. The young man paused when he heard her words. What she said was true. After Lydia used the special technique, Grey was a sitting duck. If not for Grey having such an impressive physique, he would have been defeated long ago. Now that the case was reversed, they felt it was not fair. They tried to abuse Grey, in hopes that he would stop his assault. Unfortunately, Grey had never been bothered with what others said about him. Moving with Klaus made him even more shameful. Lydia struggled, but she still couldn't help herself. She was only able to keep herself on the platform. Other than that, she couldn't do anything else. "Aren't you tired of getting beat up?" Grey asked him slowly. He was purposely not eliminating her because he wanted to dampen the morale of those from the Syphilis faction. The elders from both factions already saw through this, and most of the elders from the Syphilis faction already tagged Grey as a terrifying opponent. Alec wasn't this evil when doing things. He was smart, but he still had a bit of conscience. Grey didn't. "Are you tired of beating me up?" Lydia asked with a smirk. "I know you can't defeat me, so you're searching for a way to make me give up." She added. He, you think so?" Grey asked with an amused smile. Lydia felt staying on the platform was her doing. She didn't know Grey was ensuring he didn't send her out of the platform too quickly. "All right, enough playing." With that, Grey prepared to kick her out of the platform once again. This time, he was dead serious. His leg stayed behind him a little longer, as if he was accumulating his energy. Dust started to gather around his feet. At this moment, the elders from the Syphilis faction stood up. "We give up," an elder hurriedly said. Bang! Crack! Grey's feet connected with Lydia's stomach once again, and a clear cracking sound resonated in the entire space. Lydia's body coiled, before shooting out at a terrifying speed. She opened her mouth to scream, but only blood came out. She fell on the ground, outside the platform, knocked out cold. "You little monster, didn't you hear me admit defeat?" the elder asked angrily. "No." Grey's voice was blank of any emotions as he turned to look at the middle-aged man from the Dawson family. The man announced him as the winner and turned to look at Lydia, who wasn't able to move. An elder from the Syphilis faction had rushed over to her and tried feeding her a tonic. "You animal, you'll pay for this!" the elder screamed when he saw the state of Lydia. She wasn't on death's door, but from all the injuries, she would wish she was dead from the pain. What he found more annoying was that her core was almost cracked. He could sense it. "I didn't kill her, I only gave her a taste of her own medicine. Also, don't threaten me," Grey said as he walked back to his seat. He was presently suffering from severe pains. After the effects of Lydia's technique wore off, he felt an influx of elemental essence across his entire body, along with intense pain. The effects of the attack were still on. Such a troubling move. He thought in annoyance before taking a seat. "Good job." Connor gave him a thumbs up. Alec also congratulated him, as well as the others from the faction. The elders looked at each other before heaving a sigh of relief. With Grey defeating Lydia, they had two powerful geniuses in the last round. Although it wasn't what they planned from the start, it was better having just one. There were still 2 more battles to be fought. If they managed to win them, then they would get 4 people in the last round. However, the possibility of that happening was not high. Those from the Syphilis faction were on another level, and everyone from the Permanent faction could sense it. Only Grey and Alec could defeat them. Chapter 848. After taking a seat, Grey brought out the healing tonic and gulped it down. When the others saw him down a bottle of healing tonic, they decided to leave him alone and focus on the other battles. A member of the Syphilis faction had stepped on the platform, waiting for the next person from the Permanent faction to come up. The 2 people who were left were a young lady and a young man. The young lady stepped on the platform and fought against the member of Syphilis faction who was standing. 10 minutes later, she was defeated by the member of the Syphilis faction. The faces of those from the Permand faction turned sour when they saw this. With this defeat, they had only one chance left to get another member into the next round. 15 minutes later, the last member of the Permand faction returned in defeat. The elders were all staring at each other with loss in their eyes. One of the things they still couldn't understand was how the youths from the Syphilis faction became so powerful. This wasn't the first time something like this was happening in the history of the competition. A few competitions back, the Syphilis faction defeated them with a glamorous victory. They weren't even able to get past the first round. This has always been a source of concern for them. 10 minutes later, the next round will begin. The middle-aged man from the Dawson family announced. Everyone from the Permand faction turned to look at one particular figure, Gray. Alec was in a good condition and his battle wasn't that tough. Gray's battle, on the other hand, was the toughest, and he was also injured from the fight. It was unknown if he would be in a good state to even fight. They all saw him drinking the healing tonic, but they didn't feel that he would be able to heal off in such a short time. 10 minutes passed in the blink of an eye. Gray. Alec walked up to Gray. Gray opened his eyes and nodded his head. He stood up and followed behind Alec. There was no use in waiting for those from the Syphilis faction to step out. Two figures stood lonely on the platform. In front of them were the 8 members of the Syphilis faction that qualified for the next round. "Are you ready to get beat up?" One of the youths pointed at Gray. Gray looked at him with his deadpan eyes. Alec couldn't help but give a wry smile. He knew Gray beating Lydia up would incur the wrath of the people from the Syphilis faction. Even the elders would want to beat Gray up. Unfortunately, they couldn't. The middle-aged man from the Dawson family chuckled when he saw this. "Begin." He looked at Gray and Alec, a little curious how they would be able to solve their current problem. After the middle-aged man declared the beginning of the battle, those from the Syphilis faction rushed forward and sent out their attacks. 3 of them went after Alec, while the rest of them went after Gray, all with angry eyes. "Try not to die," Alec said before attacking his opponents. Gray nodded before attacking as well. He instantly brought out his inscriptions. While doing this, he was preparing an array that would boost his teleportation speed on the platform. His figure shot into the air, and with hands spread apart, large boulders covered blue flames appeared and started falling at an insane speed in the direction of the members of the Syphilis faction that came his way. Different attacks shot out, and they managed to block and destroy the boulders that were coming their way. Gray continued his assault with his inscriptions, while also sending out more attacks. The youth separated, making it difficult for Gray to get them with a large area of effect attack. They started an intense battle with Gray. On Alec's side of the platform, he was also fighting a tough battle against a lesser number of opponents. The platform was covered with a series of attacks, lighting up the entire platform. Gray's part was particularly flashy. His inscriptions gave the air a different kind of scenery. The battle continued with greater intensity. Gray and Alec had not only managed to fight against multiple opponents, they were on the verge of taking out one of them. Gray's figure flashed and appeared close to one of the young men fighting against him. The young man predicted this and managed to dodge Gray's attack. The person close to the young man attacked Gray's figure when he appeared. Gray didn't look at the attack coming his way, rather, he continued going after the young man. When the attack was about to hit his figure, he blinked, and there was a change in the clothing of the person standing on where Gray's was previously standing. It was surprisingly one of the young ladies who were standing on a different part of the platform. She was from the group fighting against Alec. The attack hit her, and she was sent flying. Gray's figure appeared on the spot where the young lady was previously standing. Beside him was a young man who was fighting against Alec. He attacked the moment he appeared on the spot, sending the young man crashing into the platform. The pressure on Alec dropped relevantly, and he capitalized on it and attacked the last young lady attacking him. With a simple switch, Gray was able to create an opportunity to take out 3 members of the Syphilis faction. It was an incredible sight that the elders were even stunned at. Gray's move first of all was very difficult to predict, and it also gave Gray a huge opportunity to lower the number of their opponents. That move, where did he learn that? An elder from the Syphilis faction exclaimed, astonished by the ability of Gray. The other elders were also stunned by the move Gray used. While they were still speaking, Alec managed to send the young lady fighting against him flying. He stood beside Gray as they looked at the remaining 5 members standing. The other 3 were lying on the ground, all grimacing from pain. The 5 standing members from the Syphilis faction were stunned by the sudden turn of events. Gray's figure changed with that of one of their own, and she was attacked. They didn't understand how Gray managed to switch places with that of their comrades. They rushed to pick up their comrades lying on the ground. They quickly tried to help them up, saving them from a quick elimination. After they helped them up, they hastily regrouped, a little flustered, but they kept a good shape, keeping those who were possibly injured safe. When they were done with that, they started to give off a strong aura that started to merge together. Gray and Alec looked at each other. "I guess you have a way to increase your strength as well?" Alec said to Gray. Gray nodded and looked at Alec, waiting for him to use his technique. Alec didn't waste any time, and with a soft flicker of his body, his aura surged up. Gray didn't say anything, and taking a foot forward, his aura surged as well. From one side of the platform, a powerful energy was gathering, and on the other side, 2 auras were shooting up. Alec and Gray's auras shot higher than that of those from the Syphilis faction, however, their numbers gave them a massive boost. Alec and Gray rushed into the group from the Syphilis faction. The battle intensified and Gray's figure was flashing through the air, attacking one person after another. He was also using his inscriptions as well. Alec has a powerful attack power. With the help of the space element, he appeared and disappeared at will. "Those 2 are impressive," Connor muttered as he looked at Gray and Alec fighting against multiple opponents. He has some knowledge about both figures, so he knew that they could handle themselves against multiple opponents. The elders from the Permanent faction were impressed by Gray and Alec's abilities. The elders from the Syphilis faction looked at the 2 monsters on the platform with a worried expression. At this rate, Gray and Alec have a chance of winning. The fact that Gray has this much strength left is insane. He was injured by Lydia, yet he was still able to fight against multiple opponents. He was even more impressive than Alec, who was well known. They started to regret the decision to let Lydia fight against Gray. It was a wrong move on their path. Lydia was the only person that could at least make things difficult for Gray and Alec. The members from the Permanent faction. Things were more than what they expected. Alec and Gray were surprising them, and if they could pull off the battle, it would go down in record for the faction. Chapter 849. Bang! Boom! 2 figures shot out from the ongoing battle, crashing on the ground. One of the figures was Gray. He quickly picked himself up and rushed into the battle once again. He was a little careless and was hit by an attack. Luckily, it wasn't without its gain. When he got hit by an attack, he also sent one of the members of the Syphilis faction flying, and that person was in a far worse state than he was. The young man who Gray sent flying was currently lying on the ground. Surprisingly, he was one of the 3 injured some time ago, so this increased the pain he was feeling from his previous injury. Before he could even stand up, Alec appeared from nowhere and sent him flying off the platform. "1 down," he said before turning to look at Gray, who was holding back the others to ensure that Alec was not disturbed. "That guy, sheesh." Alec didn't even know what to say about Gray. From his guess, he felt maybe Gray would be on his level, or even below him. After Gray managed to ward off Lydia, he took him to his level, but now, he felt he was the one below Gray. Well, he knew in terms of strength, he was below Gray. First off, Gray had a higher number of attack options given his multiple elements, and the fire and lightning elements he had shown were actually 2 special types. It was insane just thinking about it. "I'm glad he's actually one of us," he thought internally before joining Gray on the platform. The members from the Permanent faction cheered when they saw Alec and Gray eliminating 1 person. Fighting against 8 people and actually eliminating one of them was an impressive feat. The elders all had a hint of smiles on their faces. Connor, on the other hand, felt his blood boiling from the excitement. He almost wanted to rush onto the platform and join Gray and Alec's fight against those from the Syphilis faction. Just watching the battle was exciting. He couldn't help but wonder how it felt like participating in such a battle. A shame I broke through early. I know we'll team up when they break through to the Sage Plane. Until then, I can only wait. Connor sighed in dejection. For the first time, he wanted to actually team up with people who were not part of his family. He had fought alongside Gray, but that couldn't really be compared to this. When they were fighting at that time, they didn't have a disadvantage in numbers, and when they raided the capital, they separated. While those from the Permanent faction were feeling elated, the atmosphere in the Syphilis faction's camp was the opposite. Gray and Alec eliminated one person. This meant that the pressure on them had dropped as well. Since they could eliminate one while they were fighting against 8, then they could definitely do it again when fighting against 7. Where did that boy come from? An elder from the Syphilis faction asked in annoyance. They only prepared for Alec, and now that was gone thanks to Gray. No idea. There are no records of his family history in the Permanent faction. I don't think they know about it. However, there's something about his family name. An elder replied. Oh, what's it? The first elder turned to look at the elder who just finished speaking. His last name's Dawson. I have no idea if he's from that Dawson family, but given the talent he's showing, there shouldn't be any Dawson family that can produce such a talent. The elder explained, and after some time he added, there's also the possibility that he's from a random low-level family. As you can see, he's only acquainted with the kid from the Dawson family, but they don't seem close. After listening to the elder's words, the others started to think about the matter. The Dawson family were well known. If they had a talent like Gray, they would not hide him. Take Connor for instance. He was well known among the younger and even the older generation in this region because of his talent. Gray is above Connor in terms of talent and strength, so he would gain more fame if he were from the Dawson family. And even if the Dawson family decided to hide him, it made no sense in letting him leave now to join the Permanent faction, which was on the decline. A lot of possibilities flashed through the heads of the elders, but they also didn't rule out the chance that he might be from the Dawson family. It might be slim, but since it was a possibility, they couldn't remove it from their list. While the elders were thinking about Gray's background, changes were happening on the platform. After Alec knocked out the young man from the platform, he joined Gray in fighting against the group once again. They wanted to use the same strategy, but it failed. They had been hit by multiple attacks and had been sent flying a few times in the space of some minutes, but they had ensured to keep themselves on the platform. Presently, the aura of those from the Syphilis faction started to increase once again. This was unexpected since after the first increase, doing this would do more harm to them than good. Their strengths might increase, but they risk damaging their cause. You're destroying yourselves, you fools! Alec screamed at them when he saw this. Even though they were not from the same faction, he couldn't stand them doing this just because they wanted to win so badly. Shut your mouth and lose, a young lady from the group said with a low growl before attacking. The others joined in on the attack as well. The elders from the Permanent faction looked at the scene with a change of expression. This was the same thing that happened during the last competition. The strength of the members of the Syphilis faction continued increasing, and they didn't stop, even when they knew it would be detrimental to them. Chapter 850. Boom! Bam! The pressure on Gray and Alec increased, and for the first time since the start of the battle, the duo weren't looking comfortable. Even when fighting against 8 people, they weren't this flustered. The duo were sent flying, crashing into the ground. They hastily jumped up and moved in 2 directions. Gray flew into the air and unleashed a powerful lightning rain on those from the Syphilis faction. The members separated when the attack was about to hit them. 2 of them were unfortunately hit by the attack. The impact of the attack sent them slamming into the ground. While in the air, Gray created a large space array on the platform to boost the teleportation speed of the space elementalists on the platform. He didn't restrict it to himself because of Alec, he only made sure to inform only him about it. There were 2 space elementalists in the ranks of those from the Syphilis faction, so if they managed to find out about it, it would be a little bit of an issue for them. Gray would destroy the array once they start using it, but for now, he would use it to his advantage. With the help of the space array, Gray and Alec moved faster than their opponents. They were faster than their opponents to begin with, but now, it was increasingly difficult for them to even hit either of them. Their figures flashed across the platform, dodging the attacks of those from the Syphilis faction while also attacking as well. As time went on, the space elementalists from the Syphilis faction noticed the sharp boost in the speed of Gray and Alec's teleportation. They quickly traced it to the array and also used it as well. The sudden boost from 2 people was a little too sudden for Gray and Alec, but they had been preparing for this from the time they started using the array. They evaded the attacks of the 2 space elementalists, but they ran into an attack from the remaining 5 figures. 2 attacked Alec, while the other 3 attacked Gray. They tried to block the attack, but the impact forced the duo back. Gray's figure flashed as he retreated from the impact of the attack and he hastily destroyed the array. The 3 people who attacked him chased after him as he retreated. One of the space elementalists appeared close to Gray and attacked. Gray was forced to block the attack, but it delayed him, giving the trio the chance to shorten the gap between them. With them already so close, Gray couldn't turn his back to them. He faced them head-on. The trio attacked, with the space elementalist by the side making things difficult. On Alec's side of the battle, things were not too different from Gray's side. He was also stuck in a battle against multiple opponents. He noticed one of them was particularly more powerful than the others. From what he deduced, this person increased his strength higher than that of the others. This made him stronger, but it also started to show immediate signs of causing him harm. This fools, to think they would be willing to sacrifice themselves for the faction. He complained as he fought. Since they were willing to do this, it meant that victory would not come as easy as he thought. 2 minutes later. Of the 7 people left from the Syphilis faction, 5 of them had increased their strength to a higher level. Gray and Alec were finding it very difficult keeping up with all of them. Everyone was starting to feel like the Permanent faction was on the verge of a loss when a change started to occur on the platform. Gray and Alec's aura started to rise as well, but Alec's aura stopped after a small increase. He didn't boost it to the highest at the start since he was trying to avoid endangering himself. This was the limit he could get to without endangering himself. When Gray used the fusion state the first time, he didn't even show an increase of up to 30% of his strength. But now, he has increased it to over 60%. The fusion state usually gives him an increase in stages, but once he gets to the peak of a plane, the increase would be a little different. It couldn't take him across planes, but he would be able to show strength that could rival that stage. It was just like the time he was at the peak of the origin plane. He could fight against people in the Overlord plane with the help of the fusion state. Now that he had 8 elements, he would normally see an increase of 8 stages, but now, it would transform into a greater strength, pushing his power above the Overlord plane. A powerful energy force exploded out with Gray standing in the middle. Alec retreated, giving him some space. The members of the Syphilis faction who were on the verge of attacking him were also forced back, unable to attack him. How's that possible? One of the elders from the Permanent faction stood up worriedly. The increase in Gray's current aura was far above what an Overlord plane could show. How that's possible is not my worry. What the hell is he doing? The elder who brought Gray into the faction screamed in annoyance. His core wouldn't be able to sustain this. He would lose everything. Another elder understood what the elder meant and said with a sigh. Unfortunately, we can't stop it any longer. Another elder said with a dejected voice. It was common knowledge that using special techniques like this to increase one's strength came with a repercussion. Even a small boost came at a price. The increase in Gray's strength was by no means small. They felt this would cause him irreparable damage. Gray on the other hand smiled when he reached the peak of the fusion state. Welcome to my domain of fire. Chapter 851. The entire platform was covered with blue raging flames. From outside the platform, it looked like the fighters were standing in an inferno, and Gray was looking down on them like a god. The only place that was covered by flames on the entire platform was where Alec was standing. A domain! Alec exclaimed unconsciously. He never expected that Gray had a domain. Without being told, he already knew this was not the effect of a special attack, rather, it was a true domain activated by someone on the platform. Since he was safe, it meant it was Gray's doing. He wasn't the only one who was stunned by the sudden appearance of the domain. The members of both factions present were stunned as well. The only person who had a calm expression was the elder who brought Gray to the faction. The other elders had a dumbstruck expression. They were already aware of Gray awakening his domain thanks to the 3 elders present on the day Gray fought against that young lady and her group. But seeing it with their eyes was still shocking. The middle-aged man from the Dawson family stood up from where he was sitting. He couldn't help but let out a surprised sigh. "What the hell is this kid made of?" he asked internally. Gray's abilities were nothing short of overwhelming when placed in the midst of Overlord Plane elementalists. To begin with, he has displayed 4 elements, and 2 of them were special types, then having the space element as well made him a difficult opponent to handle. Adding his insane physique, as well as his inscriptions to it, he was already miles ahead of the others on the same plane. Now, he not only has a technique that can improve his strength well above the Overlord Plane, but he has also awakened his domain as well. And from the looks of things, it was something even those first-stage Sage Plane elementalists would have difficulties handling. Using that in a battle against peak Overlord Plane elementalists is almost like a cheat. The elders from the Syphilis faction stood up on their feet when they saw Gray use his domain. He hadn't even started attacking properly, but the fact that he had it already placed his opponents at a disadvantage. "Are you sure he's in the Overlord Plane?" One of the elders looked around and asked. He just couldn't believe something like this was possible. Gray awakening his domain at such an early stage was a shocking discovery, not just to them, but to the entire continent as well. There are people who awaken theirs in the Sage Plane, and they're already called geniuses. If those people were called geniuses, what was Gray then? The discussions about Gray's domain continued, and so did the ongoing battle. With the activation of Gray's domain, and using his fusion state to the peak, his aura was unstoppable. His figure flashed and he appeared in front of one of the young men from the Syphilis faction. With a wave of his hand, a powerful stream of fire gushed out and sent him flying. The young man tried to block the attack, but he was barely able to set up a defensive wall before he was sent into the air. While he was mid-air, Gray's figure appeared close to him and he threw a punch in his direction. The punch resounded out with a sonic boom. Crash! Bang! The young man's figure crashed straight through the platform and landed on the ground. He didn't fall from the platform, rather, the force created a hole on the platform that his figure passed through and crashed on the ground, 10 meters away from the platform. Everyone watching the battle froze in shock. Gray's last attack was vicious and very powerful. He didn't hold back when he attacked, and a platform that had kept its condition from the start of the battle was broken from just one attack. Alex stood on the same spot, unsure of what to do. His mouth was wide open, and his eyes continued to twitch excessively. Since when has someone of this caliber ever appeared? A question floated through his head. The answer to the question was obvious. He had never heard of anyone who possessed such unimaginable powers. Gray wasn't only powerful when it came to elemental attacks, but he also seemed to have an outrageous physical strength. It was evident in the battle against Lydia, as well as his last attack. While everyone was in a state of shock, Gray continued his attack. He flew straight to one of the young ladies injured when he used his switch skill some time ago. The group were all fighting against the heat from the domain of fire, and Gray was also simultaneously using the domain to attack them. In a bid to fend off the attacks, they had no time to even help each other, much less fight against Gray or Alec. Gray appeared in front of her, and the domain seemed to contract. With that, the power of the fire level increased by a few times. The young lady screamed in sheer pain, and tears started to drop from her eyes. Unfortunately, they didn't even get out of her eyes before they dried off. Gray threw a blow, and the young lady was sent out of the platform. Her appearance was one others wouldn't want to look at. The remaining 5 members from the Syphilis faction grouped together. They stared at Gray, terror-stricken. Gray was single-handedly taking them apart, and he wasn't even being strategic about it, he was forcefully doing it. This was what it meant to be powerful. Even in the midst of multiple opponents, he could do whatever he wanted, eliminate or even kill whoever he wanted, and the rest couldn't stop him. Alex stood on the side. Presently, he was a bystander in the battle. The truth was that he was still finding it hard to believe there was actually someone like Gray. How is it possible to train to this level? What was worse was that this wasn't Gray's full strength, he still hadn't displayed the mental attack he used against Lydia. Chapter 852. Connor looked at Gray, shaking his head wryly. He didn't dare to say Gray was a genius on his level, while at the peak of the Overlord plane, two of him can't fight against the current Gray, much less fight against him alone. Initially, he had felt Gray's strength mainly lay in his speed. Only after watching Gray go all out did he understand that he had misunderstood everything all this while. Gray's strength was far more than what he could imagine. Can I defeat the present him? He couldn't help but ask himself. Thinking of the question, he didn't feel confident in being able to defeat Gray as things stand. One has to know that he has already broken through to the Sage plane, and is a well-known genius among the youths. If even someone like him couldn't beat Gray, it goes to show just how powerful Gray was at the moment. The elders from the Permanent faction exchanged glances, and the same thought flashed through their heads. We have to protect him at all costs. It was at this moment they realized something, and their facial expressions changed drastically. Stupid brat! If he harms his core, I'll personally kill him. An elder said, infuriated at the thought of Gray damaging his core to get this powerful because of the battle. The others looked at the elder, and it was surprisingly the most quiet amongst those sent out. He had barely said anything since they left the faction, but he was forced to speak just thinking of the harm that would most likely befall Gray after using this technique to increase his strength. The Syphilis faction is to be blamed for this, another elder said. The other elders turned to look in the direction of the members of the Syphilis faction, and their anger shot to its peak. The elders from the Syphilis faction had also thought of this, they were already thinking of ways to eliminate Gray. Yes, it was forbidden, but it wasn't as if something like this hadn't happened before. It was even happening at the present time, so long as they were not caught, it was fine. Gray's talent made him a threat to any faction that's not on the good side of the Permanent faction. It was natural for each faction to compete against each other, but lately, the Permanent faction had been getting the short end of the stick for some time now due to their decline. They couldn't fight since it would cause a possible war between two factions. War was not something they wanted. He's damaged his core. Even if they managed to win this, it wouldn't matter, we'll get it next time. An elder from the Syphilis faction chuckled and looked in the direction of the elders from the Permanent faction with a mocking smile. She could sense the rage boiling in the eyes of the elders from the Permanent faction. She knew it had to do with Gray using a special ability to increase his strength, thereby damaging his core. Oh right, I forgot about that. A skinny elder muttered while staring at Gray with dark eyes. The others nodded to his words. Back on the platform. All 5 members were currently standing beside each other, trying to protect themselves from the inferno. Gray's figure flashed and his appearance suddenly changed. When the audience looked at his appearance, they realized he wasn't the one standing there, instead, it was one of the members from the Syphilis faction. They looked at where the 5 were previously standing and Gray's figure was currently there. The 5 also noticed this as well, and just as they were about to leave, they felt a terrifying weight on their bodies and they crashed into the ground. Stay. Gray's voice was low, but everyone on the platform, as well as outside the platform, heard it clearly. It was like the voice of a monarch, telling his subordinates not to move an inch. The figures of the 4 members of the Syphilis faction stopped and slammed into the ground, they weren't even able to get themselves to stand up. They hastily used their elemental essence to create a defensive force field around them, to ensure the fire doesn't harm them in the same way it did to the young lady a few minutes ago. As the bodies of the youths touched the ground, Gray sent out quick kicks, sending them flying. Once their bodies left the area of his gravitational force field, they felt relieved and hastily tried to regain their bearings. Unfortunately, Gray would never give them that chance. He raised his hand into the sky and an orb made of 4 different colors appeared in his hand. The strength of the orb was something that once again took the elders off their seats. "What the hell is that?" an elder from the Syphilis faction exclaimed. He merged his 4 elements into one attack. Do that. The next elder was short of words. They've seen and heard of people boosting their attacks with a second element, but Gray's current attack was a complete merger. This wasn't using one element to boost the attack, rather, it was actually merging them into one. The orb exploded out with a colorful but deadly light. The 4 figures who were mid-air tried to block the attack, but they were sent crashing out of the platform. They slammed to the ground and passed out. The last member of the Syphilis faction looked at everything with disbelief in his eyes. Gray just knocked out 6 out of 7 people. They were all at the peak of the Overlord plane, yet in the presence of Gray, they were like Origin plane elementalists. They couldn't even resist. Gray's figure soon appeared in front of the young man. He wanted to speak, but no words came from his mouth. With a loud scream, he tried to fight against Gray. He would never give up without a battle. "Foolish," Gray said, and the domain contracted once again. It gave the same result as when he did it against the young lady. Chapter 853. Gray stood on the platform, the young man's figure shooting out of the platform like a broken kite. His state was no different from that of the young lady who Gray attacked the first time as well. Alex still had his mouth wide open. He had already stopped using his special technique to boost his strength for some time now since it was pretty much useless. Gray's abilities made it look like he had no issues with defeating the entire team there. Well, honestly, he didn't have an issue with doing that. He could easily defeat them all, Alec included, and this was Alec being sincere with his feelings. For the first time in his life, he was admitting defeat wholeheartedly. He didn't even want to fight against Gray, much less be his enemy. Gray was still in his fusion state. He realized that those from the Syphilis faction were staring at him with a mocking smile, and his mind quickly went into overdrive. It didn't take him long to figure out what they were all thinking. He has crippled himself. Why not go along with their thoughts? He pondered. His aura started to weaken, and before long, it went back to its previous peak Overlord plane state. However, they could all obviously see the considerable change in it. "Ha ha, I told you, he has damaged his core." The elder from the Syphilis faction who spoke about this previously laughed when she saw this. To them, this was a bigger victory compared to what they were supposed to get from the secret realm. Yes, the place would help them nurture more talent, however, there's no secret realm that could help them create a monster like Gray. As long as Gray didn't die, or foolishly ruined himself, which he just did, they knew there was no way he wouldn't be a force to be reckoned with in the future. But now, that danger was eliminated. Alec was the first person to rush over to Gray. "Are you all right?" Gray nodded, before taking slow steps back to his seat. Everyone could tell that he was exhausted. Void couldn't help but roll his eyes when he saw Gray walking back in such a state. He knew for a fact that Gray was in a perfect condition, yet he was trying to make these people feel like the battle took a toll on him. "Drama queen," he said to Gray. Gray almost tripped when Void said this. When Alec, who was behind him, saw this, he quickly went over to assist him. Gray didn't reject it since it would make him seem a bit too proud. "They think I ruined myself, I want to keep it that way. Even though they will eventually find out later in the future, I believe this would keep me from their view for now," Gray explained to Void. "Oh, now I see." Void nodded in realization. At first, he thought Gray was doing this to draw sympathy from the elders in the Permanent faction so he could be rewarded more, but now that he thought about it, he recalled hearing even the elders from the Permanent faction speaking of Gray damaging his core. Not bad. But try to milk them as well, they have some shiny things I want, Void suggested. Gray didn't bother to reply to Void's statement. He already knew Void was a shameless figure, so he wasn't surprised by his words. When he got back to his seat, all the members of the faction, including the elders, looked at him with a different expression. The youths looked at him with glowing eyes. All they had for him was respect. He was the one who single-handedly brought victory to the faction. After beating Lydia up, he was able to fight against 7 opponents on his own. They weren't even adding Alec to the scenario since they've forgotten about him after he eliminated the first of the 8 members from the Syphilis faction. Gray stole the entire show, and this battle was one they would speak of for years to come. Connor looked at Gray. "You really overdid it, didn't you?" "A little." Gray replied weakly. "You shouldn't have gone this far," Connor said softly. Gray's talent was shocking. It would be a shame if it ended here. "I'll be fine, don't worry about it," Gray reassured him. He didn't even bother to take a healing tonic since it was useless. Entering the fusion state had already healed up all the injuries and exhaustion he was feeling from the start of the battle. The middle-aged man from the Dawson family stepped on the platform to announce the winner of the battle. The Permant faction won naturally, and they were given the right to the secret realm. The elders from the Syphilis faction walked over to the side of the Permant faction. "Congratulations, you produced a great seed this time," the lady said with a smile. The facial expressions of the elders from the Permant faction didn't show the smile they would have worn after gaining this victory. Instead, they looked a little downcast. If Gray has truly damaged his core, then it was a terrible blow for them. Even the faction leader will feel devastated by the news. The elders from the Syphilis faction laughed and left the place with a smile. With the members of the Syphilis faction gone, only those from the Permant faction were left, as well as the middle-aged man and Connor who were from the Dawson family. "We'll be taking our leave now," the middle-aged man from the Dawson family said before disappearing. "Goodbye." Connor waved at Gray and Alec before his figure disappeared as well. Now, only those from the Permant faction were left in the place. The elders still had a sour expression. "Come with us." The elder who brought Gray into the faction held his hand and they disappeared. The youths looked at each other with a lost expression. They could guess the reason the elders took Gray with them. Chapter 854. In a separate space. Gray and the elders from the Permant faction were standing in the sky. "Why did you do it?" the elder who brought Gray into the faction asked with a straight face. "What?" Gray asked, trying to feign not knowing what they were talking about. "You know what I'm talking about. You damaged your core. Why did you do it?" "There was no use taking it to that extent," the elder said. "Oh, that. Well." Gray was about to speak when an elder tried to grab his hand. He knew what the elder wanted to do and instinctively let out all his defensive measures, the gravitational field included. He used the space element to retreat before saying, "I'm fine." The elder who tried to grab his hand froze for less than a second before looking at Gray in shock. He didn't expect such timely response from Gray. He only wanted to see the extent of Gray's injury. What he found shocking was not only Gray's quick reaction, but the fact that it managed to stop him for that split second when he retreated. He was above an elemental venerable, and already an elemental sovereign, yet Gray, who was still an overlord plane elementalist, was able to stop him. Even if it was for a split second, it was still something that was deemed impossible. "I mean no harm, I only want to check the extent of your injury," the elder explained. "Honestly, I'm fine. The only reason I pretended to be injured is to make them think that I'm not a threat." Gray didn't hide his intentions from the elders and told them the truth. Since he was part of the faction, he had to show them his loyalty. Besides, he had been gaining a few things from the faction lately, things he didn't want to stop now. "So, you're saying you pretended to be injured?" the elder who brought him to the faction asked. Gray nodded and used a hint of the fusion state once again. This was the only way he could show them that he was fine. He didn't dare to let them touch him to inspect his condition. That would be deadly to him if they were to sense the orb in his body. Not just the orb, but his 8 other elements as well. The elders froze when they saw Gray using signs of his special technique to increase his strength again. They calmed down when they realized Gray was fine, but then it hit them. There was no technique for increasing strength that didn't have any repercussions. If Gray was fine after using his special technique, then it meant it must be top tier, even higher than the one they had in the faction. that was not the only thought in their heads. Normally, after using a special technique to boost one's strength, it was suicidal to use it again within a short time. Gray used it to prove that he was fine. Even if he didn't use it to the peak, he still used an ounce of it. Just what type of technique does he have? This was the thought going through the heads of most of the elders. Nice move, you're smarter than most people your age. A voice interrupted the other elders who were thinking about Gray's special technique. It was none other than the voice of the man who brought Gray to the faction. The other elders realized they were thinking too much. Gray's technique was very tempting, but not as tempting as having Gray in their ranks. Now they started to think of what Gray said. He tricked their enemies into thinking he was injured. This showed that he was very experienced and cool-headed when making decisions. Ha ha, good kid, you tricked them into thinking you were wasted. Even though they will find out later in the future, it's still amazing. It would be nice to see their expressions when they do. The elder who rarely spoke laughed out loud. He was happy that Gray was not injured. The rest things didn't matter to him. If any of the elders tried to even question Gray about his technique, he was one of the few who would attack them. You can go back. The space elementalist among the elders sent Gray back. With Gray gone, only the elders were left in the separate space. What do you all think about the kid? An elder asked. I like him, he's smart. The elder who rarely spoke said with a smile. We know nothing about him. Do you think we can trust him? The elder who tried to touch Gray said. He told us his motive behind feigning his injury. This showed he placed a little trust in us. The elder who brought Gray to the faction said. Did you see how he retreated when I tried to touch him? The elder asked. We all have secrets, Micah, don't worry too much about his. The space elementalist among the elders said. The others nodded. They all had secrets as well, so it was natural for a genius like Gray to have secrets, multiple secrets even. Even Alec has secrets as well, so it was not an issue to them. As long as Gray didn't show any signs of betraying them, then they were fine with him, whoever he was. They left the separate space after speaking for a few more minutes. Gray and the others were speaking. He wasn't really saying much, just listening to them tell him thank you. They stayed there for a few more minutes and the elders gave each of them a healing tonic, and after taking it, they were taken back to the faction. 2 elders were left behind to keep guard over the portal to the secret realm. Gray and the others would be heading back to take their rewards for winning the competition. To be honest, Gray was looking forward to the points he would be receiving from the faction. He still had a lot of books to read on arrays. Chapter 855. Permanent Faction. Gray and the others returned a few hours later. The faction had already been informed of the result of the battle, so most of the members who were in the faction were waiting outside for them to return. When the spatial tunnel opened up and the figures of Gray and the elders appeared, the youths in the crowd cheered loudly. They've known of how the faction has lost each of the previous competitions in a row. In fact, it was almost common knowledge that they would always lose whenever they fought against the syphilis faction in this particular competition. The reason for it was because of the special technique they used in increasing their strength. Unlike the permanent faction, the members of the syphilis faction seemingly weren't scared of ruining their cause, which was a shocking thing. The group was welcomed by all the youths. Some elders were also present, and they were all smiles since this was something they had been waiting for a long time. Gray and Alec were the main stars of the show, with Gray being the main person who took all the spotlight. Most of the youths tried to speak with the Gray, but since he wasn't that social, he spoke with them a little before heading over to meet Keith. He didn't stay long before he was summoned by the faction leader. The entire group, as well as the elders who went for the competition, went along as well. The elders led the group to the largest mountain in the faction, and they entered the faction's hall where the faction leader was waiting for them. This was different from the first time Gray met the faction leader. At that time, they didn't meet in the faction's hall, rather, they were taken to a secret cave. Gray looked at the man sitting on the middle seat in the hall. Just like the first time, he wasn't emitting any aura, but Gray could sense an incredible aura around him. Well done, the man said in a calm voice, but everyone could see the joy on his face. He looked at all the participants in the competition, without giving any of them any special attention. The youths, as well as the elders, greeted him before taking a seat. "I'm proud of you all for not only participating in this competition but also bringing victory to the faction. As promised, everyone will be rewarded with 2,000 points, as well as the right to train in the secret realm. As you all know, the limit for this particular realm is the Sage Plane. This is why it's so valuable to us." The man continued after everyone sat down. Those in the Sage Plane could enter this realm, unlike most realms that don't accept people over the Overlord Plane. He didn't speak about Gray or Alex's performance. Instead, he praised everyone who participated in the competition. The other members were elated when they heard the rewards they would be getting. They all knew they didn't do anything. Although they tried their best, they were defeated nonetheless, leaving only 2 people to fight against 8 people. If not for Gray and Alex's abilities, the story would have been the same as the previous competitions. After speaking with them, he told them to leave and accept their rewards. There would be a ceremony later that day to celebrate the victory of the group. Also, a few people would be chosen to go into the secret realm as well. Gray had zero interest in the ceremony. All he wanted to do right now was to use his points and improve his knowledge. When Gray was leaving, he received a secret message to stay behind from the faction leader. He already expected this in the first place, so he didn't rush out. Gray Dawson. The man called his full name. "Yes, faction leader." Gray looked up to stare into the eyes of the man. "Can I trust you?" The man straightforwardly asked him. Gray paused for some time, not expecting a question like this. After some time, "You can." The faction leader looked at Gray for some time before nodding. "You can leave. Also, for your good work, you can bring anyone you want with you to the secret realm." Gray thanked the faction leader before leaving. He originally thought the faction leader would want to speak about other things, but after asking if he could trust him, he didn't say anything other than giving him extra rewards. Going back to his place, he went over to Keith's place. By the time he left the faction's hall, the tales of Gray's performance has already started to spread across the faction. Gray already knew something like this would happen from the start, so he tried to hide from people while going back. It was very easy for people to recognize him. The reason for this was simple: there was no one as handsome as he was in the entire faction. He was very famous even before this event. Now that the stories of his phenomenal performance started to spread, his fame in the faction spread even more, especially among the ladies. With a mask and a cloak, he was able to get to his place without much disturbance. He was only stopped when he first left the faction's hall. This was how he knew about what was happening in the faction. Keith's place. "You're very famous now," Keith said with a chuckle when he saw Gray coming into his place. He knew Gray was not social, so he found his present situation a little funny. "I really wished it wasn't like this," Gray said with a wry smile as he kept his mask and cloak. "You're powerful. What did you expect? It's just like that Alec guy. He's also very famous, even though he rarely stays in the faction," Keith replied. They continued speaking for some time before Gray asked him a question that stunned him. "Would you like to enter the secret realm to train?" Gray asked. "I can't afford to go," Keith replied with a shake of his head. This wasn't the only secret realm the Permanent faction owned. To enter the secret realm, either they won a competition that would be held, or they used their points for it. To enter a secret realm cost a whopping 800 points. Although it was very difficult to accumulate such a large amount of points, as long as one wanted to enter, they would have to go out more for points. The faction made everything all about points for a single reason: if the members don't go out for missions, there was no way they would grow stronger. Since they would always need points for things, they had to head out for missions, and these missions were things that would make them grow stronger. Of course, there have been a few members who had died on these missions, but it mainly has to do with their judgments. The level of every mission was stated there, so they all knew what to expect when going out for a particular mission. If any of them overestimated their abilities, then they didn't deserve to be geniuses. Chapter 856. Later that day. Gray's house. Gray was sitting down, reading a book he just took from the faction's library on arrays. He didn't have time to waste, he still had to think of a way to remove the mark on his back. He was still reading when he sensed someone coming into his place. Before long, he heard a knock on his door. Dropping the book, he walked over to the door. Opening it, he saw Alec standing outside with a smile. "You're not going?" Alec asked when he saw Gray's state. "Going where?" Gray asked with a confused expression. "The ceremony the faction leader spoke of." Alec couldn't believe Gray had forgotten about the ceremony they spoke about earlier that day. It hadn't even been up to 3 hours yet, and Gray has forgotten about it. Ceremony. Gray paused and tried to think. He soon recalled the faction leader speaking of a ceremony to celebrate the victory. "Oh, I completely forgot about it," he said with an awkward smile. He invited Alec into his place. When Alec entered his place, he stood frozen stiff. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Are there still any books left in the library?" His eyes twitched multiple times when he saw the amount of books on the side of Gray's chair. Gray brought out all the books since he wanted them for reference. After the competition, his rank in the faction increased. From rank 2, he was currently a rank 5 member. He was the only member in rank 5 that was in the Overlord plane. With his new rank, he went to higher ranks to acquire as many books on arrays as he could find. When the young lady in charge of the library saw the number of books he was taking home, she couldn't help but take a double look at Gray's badge. "Sorry about this," Gray said before keeping all the books in his storage ring. He went inside to get dressed and came out with new clothings. He was currently wearing a white long-sleeve shirt and blue trousers. His hair was well combed, and he gave off an aura of fresh air. When he came out, Alec couldn't help but click his tongue. He had to admit, Gray was not only stronger than he was, but he was also far more handsome. He had never seen anyone that was as handsome as Gray. Dressing up made Gray even more handsome. They left Gray's place, and on the way, they met up with Keith, who was with Void. "You finally left your place?" Void mocked when he saw Gray. After the journey, he couldn't believe that all Gray did was to collect books from the library, with more than half of his points. He didn't even get him anything shiny. He decided to hang out with Keith since Gray would be too busy reading the books he took from the library. "The cat can talk?" Alec was a little taken aback. He saw Void with Gray when he first met him, but he never thought Void could speak. He only concluded that Void was Gray's pet. "Yes, and my name's Void." Void was the one who replied. There was no use in hiding the fact that he could speak anymore. It wasn't like it would change much if people knew he could. "Oh, sorry. It's nice meeting you, Void." Alec apologized for his manner of addressing Void. "It's okay. Do you have any shiny objects?" Void asked, almost like a criminal who wanted to rob someone. Gray almost facepalmed when he heard this and dragged Void by the tail before holding him in his hands. "We should get going," he said to Alec and Keith. Keith had already used the Void's way since they had traveled together a few times when he was going out for missions. There was a time Void robbed people of all their shiny treasures. Luckily, he only robbed those who were bad people, well, those he deemed were bad people. They got to the place where the ceremony was held and it was already filled up. When Gray and Alec made their appearance, they drew all the attention. Keith, who was walking with them, was barely noticed by anyone. Gray's appearance dumbstruck most of the young ladies in the place. They almost couldn't take their eyes off him. "Every single time, this is why I hate occasions," Gray complained internally. "In times like this, I miss Klaus," he thought as they walked over to their seats. "You're Gray?" a young lady who was close to their seats asked. Gray didn't need to check before knowing she was in the Sage plane. The young lady should be around his age, if not younger with a year. "Yes, you are?" Gray tried to be as courteous as possible. "Eva," the young lady replied with a smile. She was genuinely curious about Gray. The story of how he was able to get his strength above the Overlord plane, and using a strength that could rival a Sage plane elementalist, has gone around the faction, so even the geniuses in the Sage plane had taken note of Gray. For someone who could show such strength against other geniuses, it meant that once he gets to the Sage plane, he would show even greater strength. Eva wasn't the only one who approached Gray. A few others, as well as some young men, also came over to him. They all knew of Alec, so they didn't need to make any introductions with him. They all spoke and enjoyed the ceremony until it was finally time for the faction leader to address them. Gray didn't think the faction leader would take the time to come to such an occasion. But he not only came from the start, but he also wanted to address them. When the faction leader stood up, everywhere became quiet, and everyone placed their attention on him. Chapter 857. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone who participated in the sparring contest, as well as those who participated in the competition and gave us the victory. The faction leader spoke calmly, but his voice was audible for all to hear. He addressed the issue of the importance of the secret realm, since it was one of the few places that allowed those in the Sage plane entry. Most secret realms had a limit of the Overlord plane, so the geniuses above the Overlord plane couldn't go in, but this particular one allowed those in the Sage plane. This was why it was coveted by other factions when the Permanent faction started to decline. The Syphilis faction was the only one that managed to succeed. This is one of the reasons why they could produce more Sage plane elementalists faster than the Permanent faction. Although the Aurora faction was superior to these smaller realms, those realms were very beneficial to youths who were still growing. In the case of Gray and the other geniuses, they would be able to grow at an even faster speed if they were sent to these special realms. Now that we've gained control over the secret realm once again, we'll be holding a competition for those who would want to enter for a training trip. The competition will start in 2 days. As a special reward for being victorious, each of the 10 individuals who went for the competition are given free access to the domain. The leader said. None of the other youths felt envious of the privilege given to those who participated in the competition. They all tried to gain a spot, but they lost in the contest, so all they can do is place their hopes in the competition that will be taking place in 2 days. The leader spoke a little longer, encouraging those who wanted to take part in the competition. When he was done, he left the occasion. There was no use in him staying there any further. Gray asked Alec if he could leave since the occasion was as good as finished. What do you mean? It just got to the fun part. Alec said with an excited smile. Fun part? Gray raised a brow. Just watch. Alec nudged him to look ahead. Gray looked forward and saw all the youths below the elemental venerable plane stepping out. What's going on? He asked curiously. There's always a special session after each ceremony hosted in the faction. The strongest geniuses from each plane would step out, well, more like each stage in said plane. For instance, you see that guy over there? Alec pointed at a young man who looked to be around 25 years old or so. Gray followed his hands to a young man with blue spiky hair. He stood just over 6 feet tall and had a well-built body. He has a short beard and mustache. That's Kevin. He's the strongest individual in the late stages of the Sage plane. He's already been at the peak for some time now, and it's said he will be breaking through very soon. Alec explained. He started to point out the other geniuses regarded as the strongest in the mid and early stages of the Sage plane. Gray listened to his words carefully while taking note of the people he called. He tried to memorize their faces and names in case of future purposes. Before Kevin started off the special session, he turned to look at Gray. I heard you've already awakened your domain. If it's not a problem, we all would like to see it. Kevin said in a booming voice. Everyone turned to look at Gray. It was said that he used his domain during the competition. This was something that the other youths found shocking. Gray was still in the Overlord plane, after all. Kevin, who was already at the peak of the Sage plane, still hadn't awakened his domain. He couldn't say he was jealous of Gray, but deep down, he wished he had awakened his domain. Don't worry, he doesn't mean any trouble. Alec reassured Gray. Gray nodded before standing up and walking over to the platform that had been raised on the ground. When Gray got to the platform, he bowed to the geniuses on the sage plane as a form of respect. They were all his seniors, and although there were a few individuals he was older than, he didn't really care about it. To him, only the strong had the right to be above others. Since he was still weaker than they were, then he was their junior. Eva, who was a year older than him, was among those on the platform. "I'm Gray." He introduced himself before taking a deep breath. His eyes glowed with pale blue light and the platform was covered with a blue inferno. However, there was a difference between this flame and the one he used previously. It gave off intense icy chills. Those at the early stages of the sage plane felt a cold chill run down their bodies, and they quickly used their elemental essence to block the effects of the cold. "Eh?" Gray let out a surprised exclamation. He didn't expect the sudden change in the temperature of his flames. Each of the elders who were present when he used his domain in the competition stood up in shock. They exchanged glances, and even the faction leader who was gone suddenly appeared. Gray deactivated the domain quickly, a little shocked by what just happened. He hurriedly sent his spiritual senses into his body and saw the pale blue flame inside him rotating slowly. Damn it! This thing couldn't pick a better time to react. He couldn't help but complain, but he still wore the same casual expression. Only those who were present at the competition found his domain strange. It had the same color as when he used it back then, but the effect was completely different, which was very abnormal. Gray looked in the direction of the elders and could also see the shock in their eyes. He almost wanted to facepalm, but he had to keep a straight face. "Icy Fire, you truly are special," Kevin praised. Chapter 858. "Thanks," Gray replied before stepping down from the platform. Alec kept his eyes on Gray all through the time he was walking back to his seat. "How is this possible?" the faction leader muttered while standing close to the elders. The elders all had shocked faces as well, stunned by what they just witnessed. They all knew of Gray's domain, and the fact that it mainly gave off heat. They weren't new to seeing an icy fire, so it wasn't a surprise to them. However, if a fire elementalist has icy flames, there's no way they would be able to use flames that gave off heat. However, Gray seemed to be able to use both icy and regular heat flames, which was something usually seen as impossible. Gray's figure suddenly blinked, and before Alec could even speak with him, he vanished. He appeared in a secret cave in the faction. Looking around, he had a sense of familiarity with the place. It was where they came to meet with the faction leader before heading for the competition. "Kid, what's up with your body?" the faction leader asked the moment Gray placed his eyes on him. Beside him were a few elders, and all of them were present at the competition where Gray used his domain. These were the elders the faction leader had complete trust in. Gray looked at the faction leader for some time and kept quiet. "You don't have to be afraid, I have no intention of harming you. Nonetheless, this is a very important matter. If others were to find out about this, then you would be in for a whole lot of trouble. I can't help you if you don't tell me how to." The faction leader told Gray his intentions. Gray looked at him for some time and couldn't help but curse at the flame that was still in his body. The reason it reacted on its own was that Gray still hadn't completely absorbed it, and given the strength it had, it could react on its own sometimes. These special flames tend to grow a certain type of consciousness when they get to a certain level. Gray thought about the situation a little longer before finally telling them about what happened when he went out for a mission. He also told them of the part where he was chased by a necromancer. Not forgetting to mention the corpse that used icy flames and how the teleportation tunnel almost broke apart before it miraculously fixed itself and he was transported to an island where he acquired the icy flame. The elders, as well as the faction leader, were a little stunned by the story. A mixture of coincidences helped Gray obtain a very powerful treasure. The part they were more worried about was the bit with the necromancer. For a necromancer to chase him that much meant two things: either he had something of theirs, or he was marked. The former had the highest possibility while the latter with the lowest chance, but it still couldn't be ruled out. The faction leader thought about Gray's story and couldn't help but think of a certain person he found when Gray joined the faction. If his guess was accurate, then the man was the one who helped Gray fix the broken spatial tunnel. Come. He stretched out his hand. Gray froze for a few seconds, unsure of what to do. Don't worry, I won't pry more than what you allow. The faction leader reassured Gray. He could already tell that Gray had an issue with trusting people, and he didn't find it odd or bad. Anyone who has been in the world for long knows not to trust people they're not familiar with. Even when you're familiar with a person, trusting them is also not something that is advised. Gray nodded before approaching the faction leader. The reason he agreed to do this was simple. Given the strength of the faction leader, he could easily hold him down and search his entire body, but he didn't, giving Gray the choice to allow it or not. This was something that was not common in such powerful people. Gray's respect for the faction leader saw an increase because of this. He gave him his hand and heard the faction leader's voice in his head, "Lead the way." Gray let his spiritual senses lead the way for the faction leader, taking him to only the place where the place was located. He was particularly happy since the flame was located in his head. If it were close to his core where the orb was also located, things would have been a little difficult for him. The faction leader studied the flame for some time before withdrawing his spiritual senses from Gray's body. He didn't even try to check on other places in Gray's body. To be honest, he wasn't really interested in doing that. You're lucky it acted out now. The faction leader spoke when he opened his eyes. Oh, is there something wrong? Gray asked. It's starting to gain consciousness. If it had reacted another time, you would have left it alone. Had it gained consciousness completely, you would have been in serious danger. The faction leader explained. Gray sucked in a deep breath when he heard this. He couldn't believe that the flame he absorbed was on the verge of gaining consciousness. This was a very serious issue. He already had the orb in his body which had a very dominating personality. The chances of both of them starting a battle in his body would have been bad for him. The orb would win, no doubt about that, but he might be injured since they would be contesting for his body. I'll subdue it so you can slowly absorb the rest of it. Only after you get to the sage plane will you be able to absorb the rest of it, so take your time. The faction leader made a few hand seals and an array appeared mid-air and sank into Gray's body. I know you're very adept in arrays, you can work on it as well so you can use the flame's abilities at will. He added with a smile. He had been keeping his eyes on Gray. When he found out Gray used more than half of his points in exchange for books on arrays, he couldn't help but shudder at the obsession of Gray and arrays. He took Gray for someone who always wanted to learn, hence he placed this array in his head as a means of letting him learn. Gray bowed to thank the faction leader for his help. Wait. The elder who brought Gray into the faction stopped him before he could leave. Gray turned to look at him. Take these, you'll need them when next you head out. The elder threw over 20 talismans to Gray. Each of the talismans gave off an aura that was superior to the one his teacher gave him. These should be talismans with an elemental venerable power. This elder should be above that plane, right? Gray thought internally. Thank you, elder. Gray bowed and gladly accepted them before turning to leave. He soon left the elders and the faction leader alone. Chapter 859. After leaving, Gray didn't see a need to head back to the ceremony. However, he couldn't leave like that as well. I hate these things. He couldn't help but complain. When he got back to the ceremony, the geniuses on the sage plane were still performing on the platform. He didn't say anything and sat down close to Alec, who was still looking at him suspiciously. Alec Sensible didn't speak of what happened, nor did he ask why Gray suddenly disappeared. He noticed Gray wasn't the only one who disappeared, and that some of the elders were gone as well. Hey, what happened? Void asked when Gray came back. He tried to follow them, but he was knocked back by the person who created the spatial tunnel that sucked Gray in. Gray told Void about everything that occurred after he disappeared. Oh wow! The flame is gaining sentience? That's amazing! Void exclaimed. With a sentient flame, Gray would have another means of attacking, just like Alice's sea lie. The only difference is that this flame is completely different. If Gray could nurture it and ensure that he had full control over it, then it would be very beneficial to him. Yeah, the faction leader sealed it to ensure that it doesn't grow to the stage where it will cause me any harm before I can control it. Gray said to Void as he watched the ongoing battles. That's nice of him. Void commented. They continued speaking, and before they knew it, the geniuses on the Sage Plane were done displaying their moves. It was time for those in the Overlord Plane to show their skills. Gray was forced to step out since he was currently considered invincible in the Overlord Plane. In fact, those in the Permanent faction were almost on the verge of tears that the usual competition between all factions and families in the region was still a few years away, had it been now that they had a genius such as Gray. Then he would have completely dominated the entire Overlord Plane battles. With his domain, who would dare to go against him while still being in the Overlord Plane? Gray didn't do too much though. After sparring with another peak Overlord Plane elementalist who didn't go for the competition, he returned to his seat. Everyone was impressed as they watched him battle. It was natural, with his present fame in the faction, he could barely do any wrongs. In fact, just walking alone seems like a good thing in the eyes of the youths. Unknown to Gray, he had grown a huge fan base. And the fan base didn't consist of only those weaker than him, even a few people in the Sage Plane were part of those who were his fans. Gray left the occasion as soon as it ended. The faction was pretty united, so even though he wasn't acquainted with most of the people, he didn't put on any airs whenever he was approached. This made those around him even more impressed by him. Gray was approachable, his only issue is his lack of communication skills. Time flew by slowly, and it was already almost a month since Gray came back from winning the competition. Most of those who went with him had already gone into the secret realm in search of an opportunity to break through. Gray, on the other hand, was still studying arrays. His love for arrays soon became well known across the entire faction. He had barely gone out for this past month, and the few times he went out was to attend an array class. Void had been traveling with Keith all this while. He didn't know what to do with Void. Keith unfortunately couldn't enter the place now since he would need to go with Gray when entering. He still hadn't found a chance to break through to the Sage Plane, and he felt like adventuring into the secret realm would be very beneficial for him. Gray was currently sitting in his place. On his hand was his communication device. He was listening to the messages he had from his friends, while also sending them one as well. By the time he was done speaking with them, he couldn't help but shake his head when. How is he so lucky? He asked internally. Klaus had broken through to the Sage Plane. Not only that, but he also managed to awaken his domain as well. Of all of them, Klaus was the one who had the lowest stage, but now, things were always different. He would get one lucky encounter after another that would make him advance at a speed that even Gray was envious of. Alice and Reynolds were still on the 8th stage, but Reynolds had nothing to worry about thanks to his elemental warrior, which had gotten to the strength of a Sage Plane elementalists. Alice's Seelie was in the Sage Plane to begin with, so she still had methods of dealing with Sage Plane opponents. Gray had both Void and the talismans his teacher gave to him. If he used his fusion state, then he didn't have any problems with going against an early-stage Sage Plane elementalist, well, one without a domain. One thing that was worth mentioning is that Keith had broken through to the Sage Plane as well. After sending some of the things he had learned about arrays to his teacher for study, he decided it was finally time for him to head to the secret realm. When Keith heard of this, he was excited beyond belief. He was currently out of points, and there was a mission that required him to enter the secret realm. Void was also very excited since they would get to experience new things. This was a secret realm he had been trying to get into from the start, so it was a great opportunity for him now that Gray had decided they should head into the secret realm. Gray walked to the teleportation array in the faction, with Keith and Void in tow. Chapter 860. Gray appeared in a place he was slightly familiar with. It was where they came for the competition. I need to break through to the Sage Plane on this trip. The time for my revenge is getting closer. If my guess is accurate, that guy should have broken through to the Sage Plane a long time ago. He thought internally. There was just over a year before the competition, and he still hadn't broken through to the Sage Plane. If he were to stay at the peak of the Overlord plane as long as he stayed at the peak of the Origin plane, then things would be extremely difficult for him. Come on, let's get going. Gray walked forward, Keith following behind him. Keith was a little nervous since, unlike others who had to take part in a competition, he was going without doing that. According to what Gray told him, he could go with him. He didn't know how true it was, but he knew for a fact that Gray wasn't the type to lie to others, especially for something like this. When they got to the portal to the secret realm, the elder in charge looked at Gray. Seeing Keith beside him, he didn't say anything other than telling them the time limit they would be spending there. Since resources are not infinite, each person who enters the secret realm can only spend a limited time inside. There was also a limit to the number of people that could go into the secret realm. If the place was flooded with too many people, then it would disrupt the balance there. Gray wasn't too bothered about the time limit. He wanted to stay till the time limit. Besides, he couldn't stay in the Aurora continent since he was still being chased by necromancers. Once I'm done with this trip and going for the competition for Sylvia, I'll start searching for my parents, he concluded. He planned to even head to the Dawson family where Connor was from before even going over to meet up with Sylvia. Since it was in this region, why wait till later? Besides, even if he finds out his parents were not from that Dawson family, he would just take it as visiting a friend of his. He also wanted to visit Kyle as well. Since they separated, he hadn't really heard from him. The few times he spoke with his friends, he only spoke with Klaus, Alice, and Reynolds. He had a lot of plans, but those will only be possible after he comes out of this secret realm. The elder removed the seal from the portal and the duo walked into it. When Gray and Keith's figure disappeared, a man appeared beside the elder. It was none other than the man secretly protecting Gray. You know you can't go in, right? The elder looked at the man. He was one of the few people who knew of this man's presence. I know, I'm just bored being alone for too long, so I decided to speak with you for some time, the man said with a soft smile. The elder nodded and they both took their seats and started to speak about life and their journeys in cultivation. Sometimes, casual talks like this can help an elementalist open a new realm they knew nothing about when it came to understanding their elements. Once an elementalist becomes an elemental venerable or higher, they rely mainly on their understanding of their elements to grow stronger. Battles mainly involve the use of domains, and a domain will not be powerful if the elementalist didn't have sufficient knowledge of his elements. In the secret realm, Gray and Keith appeared together, and some youths were there. They gave them all the information they needed on the place. This realm had humanoid figures as well, just like the Horned race. However, unlike humans and the Horned race, this race was a little different. Their skin color varied from green to red and brown. Basically, each individual's skin showed their elemental affinity. From the start, they all knew what elements they were attuned to without having to have a test like humans. Those of the Horned race had things a little different. Gray summoned the triplet he captured from the Horned race. They were still at the peak of the Overlord plane, and this was a good opportunity for them to advance. After watching Void break through the last time, they gained some enlightenment, a few more things, and they would be able to break through. Gray handed the two-headed snake to Keith since it was already in the Sage plane, it would be able to protect him in such a place. We should go our separate ways here. I wish you all the best on your journey. We'll meet in 6 months. Gray said to Keith. Before leaving he turned around once again. Also, take this, you can communicate with me with this. If you're in any trouble that Guy can't deal with, just send a distress signal and I'll be able to find you. He tossed a communication device at Keith. This one was special, compared to the others he had made. He can use this to track down Keith. He also gave the triplets one each and told them it would be better for them to move out separately. But everything ultimately lied on their decision. When he was done with everyone, he turned around and left decisively, Void sitting proudly on his shoulder. Finally, time for chaos. Void laughed playfully. We're only here to train, no one is causing any chaos. Gray said with an apathetic voice. You're no fun. However, I can already see the people here trembling at the mention of my name. Void said with a majestic voice. "You're not going anywhere on your own, now sit tight, our journey starts now." After saying this, Gray's figure flashed and he disappeared from the spot he was standing on. Keith and the triplet exchanged glances. The triplet couldn't help but remember when Gray came to their world. They looked at this world, and pity flashed through their eyes. This is the end of this video. Thank you guys for listening. Hope you enjoyed and wish you wonderful rest of the day. The Silent Raptor's out.